You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, the second to last this week, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're surely listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. Heads up, it's August 19th, 2021, just past 7 a.m. Eastern. First up in headlines, let's get into the COVID news. We've got about 162,700 new COVID cases reported yesterday in the United States. There were also about 1,130 new deaths reported. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 140,900 cases per day. That's an increase of 47% from the average 2 weeks earlier. That increase percentage, 47%, like 52%, keeps dropping. For a while there, it was doubling. That's better. You know, even though objectively the numbers are going up, the fact that the slope of the mountain as you're going up it is getting less steep. In other words, it's sort of flattening out a bit. Still good, even though the numbers are objectively very, very, very large right now.
Yeah, I feel you.
Compared to where
1,000 is.
Yeah, hope.
Yeah.
Over 1,000 deaths. And again, over 160,000 new cases. And it was just a couple of days ago that we saw a day in which we had, it's like one of the worst days during the entire pandemic in terms of new cases. 250-something thousand new cases. I'd have to go back and check the exact number. But my point is, that's really up there. Nobody really expected this, or at least very few people did. And yet, here we are. In national news, in a speech with ABC News yesterday, President Joe Biden said that chaos was inevitable, quote unquote, as America withdrew from Afghanistan. We're going to be coming back to this in a couple of minutes because as listeners of the show know, we've been playing this clip from July where Biden is, you'll hear, just a month ago, he didn't think chaos was inevitable, but, you know, hindsight's 20/20. And I think you need all the pairs of glasses you can get when you're that old. The city comptroller for New York City, Scott Stringer, released an explosive report yesterday highlighting the city's failures to prepare for and respond to the pandemic, saying that the city's quote-unquote initial response to COVID was hampered by a lack of planning, coordination, and preparedness across city government, end quote. Chief among the findings was a long-term failure by the city government to plan for a pandemic, relying instead on a nearly 8-year-old drafted plan that was never finished to respond to the virus. That plan didn't contain details on obtaining medical supplies during a crisis, distributing them, or when schools should be closed and reopened. Stringer said the 30-page review included only his office's initial findings because City Hall has consistently fought his subpoenas for documents from the health department, public health system, and the mayor's office. Basically, de Blasio's staff, his administration, and probably de Blasio himself, they don't want to give Stringer access to this stuff because it probably won't make them look very good. De Blasio, when pressed on this, has blamed Cuomo. He said that the authorities above him didn't give him the guidance that he needed, didn't give him the support that he needed. Yeah. But de Blasio has cast himself, he's like an opponent. He's like a political opponent. He's fighting with Cuomo for supremacy in the state of New York. In other words, I want to put it like this. De Blasio is pulling a super weak move here. He's saying, my political enemy didn't give me all the help that I needed. Well, no, this is your chance to establish yourself, right? This is de Blasio's chance to be like, to make him the king in the castle and show that Cuomo, the governor, is not up to par. My point is he could have handled this way better. Instead, he decided to pass the buck upwards. Yesterday, the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the Texas law effectively banning second trimester abortions. The decision marks the first time a U.S. federal court has upheld a prohibition on standard abortion methods. Those who violate this law can face up to 2 years in prison. The Biden Justice Department has warned Missouri lawmakers about a new gun bill passed in the state. They've said the bill would violate federal laws. That bill bars state and local officials from enforcing any laws or actions that violate Missourians' Second Amendment rights, which the DOJ argues is an attempt to supersede federal laws, saying it, quote, purports to nullify certain federal firearm laws, prohibits enforcement of those federal firearm laws, and imposes civil monetary penalties on political subdivisions and state law enforcement agencies that enforce or assist in the enforcement of those federal firearm laws, end quote. In international news, the United States Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and its chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, fielded questions from reporters yesterday during which they declared the airport in Kabul secure and said evacuation flights were ongoing, saying that they plan to evacuate all American citizens and as many Afghan allies as possible, quote, end quote. Again, that's not saying they're planning on evacuating all Afghan allies, which is something they're being questioned on quite hard right now. They repeatedly did not answer questions about how they could ensure American evacuation. And there was also an interesting interchange between a reporter who asked Milley about Bagram Air Base and the prospect of retaking Bagram Air Base, the idea that, it was a bad idea to abandon it in the first place. Bagram Air Base, again, this is the one that a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. pulled out of and was quickly looted, ransacked by not the Taliban necessarily, just people, it seems. And then the Taliban came in.
Yeah. We left, didn't tell anybody.
We left. We didn't tell anybody, didn't tell the Afghan government. We just pulled out. Anyway, that has 2 runways, and it's outside of the city. And if you compare that with Kabul's airport, which has 1 runway and is inside of the city, if you think what's easier to sort of secure from a military standpoint for evacuation purposes, it is true, Bagram.
Easy.
But we've already pulled out. The report, Milley doesn't really answer why we pulled it out in the first place, how wise that was, etc. But he does suggest, it says it's a good question, and sort of suggests that we might consider invading Bagram again, which is the truly weird part. So it's like, wait, we pulled out, that was a mistake. Now we're going to go back in to expedite this evacuation. But you guys realize this is a cluster F, right? You guys realize you're not chasing your tail between your legs because it's fun anymore. You're doing it because you're frightened.
Yeah.
And what you're doing doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It's going from here to there again. You know what I mean?
It's entirely reactionary at this point. It's, oh, we didn't expect it to fall apart. Oh, it fell apart. Oh, it looks bad. We're embarrassed. We need to cover our you-know-whats. And then it becomes, but that's, I don't know if you realize how weird that answer is. We've left the country, but yeah, we may come back and take the airbase. Yeah. How does that look? How does that work? You're going to get into another fight with the Taliban in your pursuit of taking the base? At this point, it's just an odd answer.
Super odd answer. Yeah. Agreed. Something to come back to, though. Hundreds of protesters carrying on with Afghanistan news. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets of Afghanistan yesterday in a rebellious display against the Taliban. The protesters were celebrating the country's independence from Britain in 1919 by removing Taliban flags and replacing them with the national standard flag. In response, the Taliban fired into the air and the crowd, trying to get them to disperse. Some people on the ground say they've been beaten up by Taliban fighters, and several have died in the cities of Asadabad, Khost, and Jalalabad. This is part of the question we want to get back into today. Basically, are they actually modernizing?
Right.
Or are they, and this is the super derogatory, maybe even offensive, or are they just living in the Stone Age still? A lot of people. In terms of religious values, cultural values, the way they treat not only women, but people in general, public executions, beheadings, things we would associate as even pre-medieval, like the worst depths of medieval society, public beheadings. That sounds outdated by 15th or 16th century probably, unless you're talking the French Revolution. My point is, this feels, or Saudi Arabia, this feels pretty out of date. So the question is, can they get past what we would call like thousands of years of history, at least hundreds of years of history? Will they have gotten past that in the course of the 20 years they've been out of power? Probably not. So what does that mean? Where are they going to go? What's that going to look like? That whole question,
Let's come back to this one.
We'll come back to it.
Because I think that's an interesting question. And I saw some really good analysis by a guy who was in that mindset. And he was trying to explain, he was like, well, 20 years ago when I was thinking this way, this is the reason why I was thinking this way. And it kind of gave this kind of psychological analysis of himself in the process. And I thought it was really interesting because it sounds, we'll come back to it. I thought it was good.
Yes. The death count in Haiti's 7.2 earthquake has risen up to 2,189 people. 12,268 have been hospitalized there, and 332 are still missing, according to Haiti's Office of Civil Protection. They also stated that 600,000 people are in need of humanitarian assistance and that 135,000 families have been displaced. The U.S. has deployed troops and other personnel to assist the country, including the warship USS Arlington, which will arrive near Haiti tomorrow. In business news, a startup for RepairSmith has raised $42 million in funding to begin a new service of traveling car mechanics. The customer will be able to book an appointment online for an inspection or repair of the vehicle, and the mechanic will come right to their doorstep for the service. This company is growing out of Mercedes' incubator program, and after seeing success there, is expanding into the greater market. Weirdly enough, I think I remember hearing about Mercedes' incubator program. Interesting idea. Traveling car mechanics come to your house to fix your car. Maybe something to talk about later. Persephone, a fully autonomous robot, is being employed as a tour guide in Greece's Allostrati Cave. Touted as the world's first robot tour guide, Persephone covers 500 feet before a human takes over and is capable of giving the guide in 33 different languages. She, although she's a robot, so, gender. Anyway, she can also answer 33 different questions, but all in Greek. Persephone is cleverly named after the Greek goddess who was kidnapped by the god of the underworld, whom she spent her life with. Austin, I'm not criticizing you on the gendering thing. I was going to make that joke regardless. I was going to be like, calling her she. And anyway, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A couple of things to come back to, Jamarl. I'll let you lead. Anything you want to talk about first?
Yeah, so the Afghan one. Why do people, issues of identity, and this kind of weird way in which identity masks itself as other things. So, this gentleman on Twitter, what is his name? I can't pronounce it. Baghdadi is the last name. But he was making the point of saying he used to be an Islamist himself, let's say like 20 years ago. And that a lot of it had to do with a certain degree of insecurity, a certain degree of looking around and seeing our countries are invaded, our countries are somewhat backwards in regards to, let's say certain traditions, and this notion of modernity and those type of things, and that they're basically under the thumb of, let's say, the West and Western influence, especially much stronger military powers. And he made this point about, in looking out to try to figure out this time of self-confidence, this time of where you felt like you mattered, or that you were a significant component of the world. And they look back to those periods. And in looking back, it's almost like an identity gets formed around that as a way of pushing back against these other ideas or against what they consider to be this kind of subjugation now. He even goes further into this thing of like, you will never be able to really solve this until you deal with certain issues of like poverty, of insecurity, of this notion of worth. Like all of that stuff is basically all on the table at the exact same time. And his point is you can't kill your way out of that. Like he's complicating it in a way, because he's saying it's not as straightforward as saying, okay, we're just going to beat these guys. How do you do that? What does that look like? And it's not clearly just one country. And when you hear stuff like, I want my country back, or when you hear stuff like, make America great again, or even this notion of hope and change, like those things also kind of in a weird way call back to that rejuvenation, or this time where we were significant, or the time where we mattered.
The golden age.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, because I don't think that's just them. I think that's just people in general when they're under the thumb like that. For example, China. Let's take China, for example, like Hong Kong. And, did ripping away Hong Kong from China have an effect on the way they saw themselves and in the way they look out at the world? Of course it did. There's a certain insecurity associated with not being able to defend or keep the country and the ground safe and everything else. And does it inform their current point of view? Yes. Of course it does. I would imagine the same thing is here. Even like Black Lives Matter, for example, where it's like people are like, oh, that's a black supremacist ideology. It's the opposite. It's this notion where you're looking out at the world and be like, the idea that you have to say my life matters gets across that you, on some level, believe other people believe that it doesn't. Like a lot of that stuff is calling back to, I think, this kind of similar energy. The energy feels familiar, even if it's in a different context. Does that make sense?
It does. But okay, so one thing, I get the general argument, but also imagine talking to a Muslim for a second and being like, well, you're a Sunni Muslim because you're poor, and I'm going to give you this money, and I'm going to elevate you. That's again, I'm not trying to put you, but I'm trying to put myself into the mind of an imagined person who you're talking to, who's like listening to you and is like, wait, what are you saying to me?
Yeah.
How do you actually view me? What do you think is going on here? And that adds some complication. Because for a lot of these people, if it's religious, and I'm like, hey, you have these religious beliefs because X, that isn't compatible with the religion from within the context of the religion.
Yeah.
Like, you're saying God doesn't exist because I'm poor? That makes no sense. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that's what you're saying.
No, that's not where we're going at all.
But it gets complicated when you get into it.
Oh, it does.
Does that make sense?
Totally. His point, he says, colonialism and modernity, a perfect storm that severed our connection with ourselves. We want, quote, we want to bring Islam back, but what we really want is to bring back our lost selves. We try to copy things from many centuries ago, looking for something authentic that represents us. He even goes and makes this point about somebody, I think he says an Iraqi or something like that, says something like, if they had their choice, they would vote for an Islamist government and go live in a Western country. Or something like that. It was like, what? But that's the point that he's trying to make, this kind of weird, odd dichotomy and complexity associated with it. It's interesting.
And because here's the thing is, the black and white photos from the 60s with women walking around in Western-style miniskirts and no abayas, no hijabs, nothing like that. They're just walking around looking for all the world, only Afghani, like they could be in any city, you know what I mean? And of course they could be as Afghans. But that, like the halcyon, the golden age thing, if that's a part of it, part of the real thing here is if you look at the population of Afghanistan over time, a lot of lives were lost in the Afghan-Soviet war. And if you look at the population over the past 30, 40 years, it's like quadrupled. Which my point is that golden age is not in the living memories of the vast majority of the population at this point. The memory of a memory of a memory and that kind of thing. But assuming that's part of it, if we go over Afghan's political history, just in the past century and a half, it's gone from being like an empire under British sort of subjugation and, mutual Russian and British influence, gone from being an empire to a monarchy, to a constitutional monarchy, to a self-declared republic, to a socialist state, to a Islamist state under the Taliban, to an American-run, quote-unquote, democracy. It's gone through all of these political transformations. And so I wonder, the golden age, I buy that, but there's also, with so few people living from that time and so much disorientation politically, do you see what I'm saying? There's this, that's true, but there are these other factors as well.
Totally. That's the complicating factor. It's like, because you can't touch that. How do you touch that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like you can get your hands around all sorts of stuff and trying to, let's say like a Marshall Plan, let's say for Japan or something like that. You can get your hands around, okay, we're going to do X, but how do you do that? Like, I mean, even in the United States, when people are looking back to this golden age, like this golden era of America, well, is that a real thing? Or is it just what they think in their heads of a thing? I think it's that. I think a lot of people in general, I don't think it's just specific to them. I think people in general, especially if they feel subjugated, undermined, they feel like they can't get a grip on their reality, or they feel like they're at work or underplay of larger forces. Yeah, I do think that golden age thing is something that is just people.
Yeah.
I don't think it's specific to them or the religion thing. I just think it's a human thing.
Totally.
But it does add complication to it, because we have to close it. But I went to this thing called the Left Forum, and while I was there, Jack Fresco, the Venus Project, they had one of the guys that was there was pushing that Venus Project. You had another guy who was like a psychologist, like a clinical or evolutionary psychologist, and I think it was like 3 or 4 people, and the group was basically having lectures on this stuff. The first guy for the Jack Fresco Project comes up and he gives this new world, this new vision, this technological world where we have all of these green spaces and electronics are within nature so you can understand and keep track of all it. Beautiful world.
Sounds very cool.
Very cool. The other guy gets up and says, that sounds great. But the reality of it is that you have some people that are born a particular way, meaning they're born with certain biases, that it's not just you think they're disagreeing with you. They frame the world differently. And in framing the world differently, how do you ever get that thing? Which these two got into an argument in the room, because what he understood was, he was like, you're trying to say that this can never come to pass. And he's like, I'm not saying it can't come to pass. I am saying you're going to need a little bit of compassion associated with it. And I'm also saying that it is going to be far difficult, or more difficult than I think you realize it. Because Jack Fresco, a lot of these guys think it's just making the argument and convincing. And his point was, no, there's certain structures in the way that people are built that can be hesitant against stuff like that, which will make your job that much more difficult and that much more complicated. I guess my point is people are complicated.
You can't just convince Afghanis to do X or Y or Z, and they can't just convince themselves of it either. Even trying to work it out, in an internal dialectical process, being hoity-toity here, it's still it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, it's complex.
The mutual communication and understanding, they're more equipped to do than we are, because frankly, they probably understand each other a lot better than we do. You'd have to assume, of course. But it's still going to be hard.
Yeah.
We got to go to a break, though. We're going to be coming back talking about Afghanistan a bit more. Also talking about Biden before and after. You'll be hearing it. We're playing clips from last night's interview between Stephanopoulos and Biden on ABC. We're also going to be getting into the clip we've been playing from Biden in July. And you'll hear the mismatch, the complete contradiction. You'll hear it for yourself. Anyway, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We've been having a conversation about Afghanistan and the fall of Afghanistan. And like I keep saying, because I think it's absolutely true, when you drop nearly $3 trillion into a country, hundreds of thousands of lives, nearly 50,000, if not more, civilians, not to mention several thousand American troops, and 20 years, and the country basically falls, seemingly, over the course of a few days, there should be an autopsy. And that's to put it mildly. Not just an autopsy. How did we get into this situation? How did it fall apart? Was there a chance for things to be better? How did all of this originate? And I don't just mean 20 years. I'm talking about 20 years even before that, when this stuff was being incentivized and pushed forward. There are questions to be asked. The White House and the administration is basically taking a tact of what I like to call butt covering. And it's not just them, it's also mainstream media, because media has to explain why they didn't know this. Why were they so shocked? If your job as a journalist is to understand what's going on behind the scenes and give a decent picture of the world to the public and everything else of what's going on behind the scenes, after all, how are you going to hold government accountable if you don't necessarily know what government is doing and if that stuff is staying in the shadows? It's their job to give you a heads up. And that job over the last 20 years was not done. And not just not done, the opposite of that. Telling you that, oh, we're making progress. Things are going well. We're going to do a surge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The issue, and the only issue they had, is when we started to pull out. It's the anti-war stuff that they don't like. Staying in a country forever, no issue. Killing a lot of civilians, no issue. But if you try to pull out, that's when there's issue. The catch here is Biden, I give him credit for that, for pulling out. What I don't give him credit for is basically pretending as if this wasn't going to fall apart in the beginning. And on top of that, not preparing, seemingly in the least, for the eventuality when it does fall apart. It is a very weird situation. They're basically ignoring our failures in this process and instead blaming the Afghan government or the Afghan army. Why won't you fight for the corrupt government? I mean, the president was trying to take $100 million out of the country, but why won't you fight for that corrupt guy? Why won't you fight? Let's play. I want you to hear, initially in the beginning, when questions were coming up about whether or not Afghanistan was going to fall apart. We kept saying on this show, to our credit, that it looks like Vietnam, that it looks like Saigon. I made the point over and over again that in my head, the image of the helicopter leaving the ceiling was something that was on my mind for weeks prior. Why didn't Biden know this? Let's play the clip of what Biden was saying initially, let's say about a month ago.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped as any army in the world, and an Air Force, against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
Can you please clarify what they have told you about whether that will happen or not?
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion.
So what is the level of confidence that they have that it will not collapse?
The Afghan government and leadership has to come together. They clearly have the capacity to sustain the government in place.
And do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. What you had entire brigades breaking through the gates of our embassy. 6, if I'm not mistaken. The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable. So the question now is, where do they go from here? That the jury is still out, but the likelihood there's going to be...
This did not age well at all. Not only were there people falling out of airplanes, you even had people found, or remains, in the compartment or the wheeling of the plane itself for people who were trying to basically escape the country. Could not be more wrong. Let's play Biden's new tune, however. Because Biden's new tune, despite the previous month, his new tune is basically, it was always going to be this way. This was always foreseeable. Let's play the clip.
When you look at what's happened over the last week, was it a failure of intelligence, planning, execution, or judgment?
Look, I don't think it was a failure. Look, it was a simple choice, George. When the Taliban, let me put it another way. When you had the government of Afghanistan, the leader of that government getting in a plane and taking off and going to another country, when you saw the significant collapse of the Afghan troops we had trained, up to 300,000 of them, just leaving their equipment and taking off. That was, that's what happened. That's simply what happened.
But we've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
What did you think when you first saw those pictures?
What I thought was we have to gain control of this. We have to move this more quickly. We have to move in a way in which we can take control of that airport. And we did.
So you don't think this could have been handled, this actually could have been handled better in any way? No mistakes?
No, I don't think it could have been handled in a way that we're going to go back in hindsight and look, but the idea that somehow there's a way to have gotten out without chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens. I don't know how that happened.
So for you, that was always priced into the decision?
Yes.
It was always priced into the decision. There was nothing I could have done better. This was always going to be this way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You had nearly a year, if not mistaken, more than a year to prepare. Early, you said there was no reason to believe that it was going to collapse. Now you're saying it was always baked into the cake. Yeah. The catch becomes, are there going to be larger consequences for basically what seems to be an utter and complete collapse? And look, while I back the choice to get out of Afghanistan, this looks appalling. Shane, what are your thoughts? And one more thing, the idea that he always thought this was going to happen. If that's true, that's worse. If that's true, that's worse. You should have been able to prepare for this. Buck stops with you, buddy.
Because didn't you just play him? I was getting myself some tea and talking to the producer for a second, but didn't you just play the clip of him?
Yes.
Again, he didn't say in the first clip, chaos will never come to Kabul. It's not like he's literally doing that, but he is directly contradicting himself.
Yes.
And it's very clear. He's trying to act like this, like he knew this was coming, of course. Very clearly, they had no idea this was coming. And that's the fundamental lie, which is so obvious that I wonder what the heck is going through any one of these people's heads.
They're trying to save face. I mean, It looks bad. I mean, part of the reason that the Afghanistan war kept going on is because nobody wanted it to look like this on some level.
Yes.
And so it's like each president basically kept goosing the egg to, keep it moving. It didn't have to look this way. I don't buy that logic at all, that, it was always going to be this way. There was no way to plan for this. There was no way to prepare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't buy it. You could see the Taliban taking one place after the next, after the next, after the next. And they keep asking him, is this a failure of planning or intelligence? And he may not necessarily want to answer that. And I get that it looks remarkably bad seeing that stuff on the airways. He's still Stephanopoulos. He was like, yeah, sir, but people were falling out of the sea, 1300 or whatever. And he was like, well, I mean, that was 4 days ago.
What? Who cares? That was
Who cares?
that was 4 days ago. That was just now.
Yeah. I mean, he's acting like, that was 4 days ago. That was years ago, George.
Yeah.
No, dude. 4 days ago. You spent trillions of dollars. You told people this was not going to happen, decidedly not going to happen. And that is exactly what happened. And now when somebody brings it up, oh, no, it was planned. It was all planned. Get out of here. And you know what's wild? Right here, this is Axios. The CIA director was traveling in the Middle East when Kabul fell. Meaning, if it was all planned, you didn't know? You had your CIA director traveling through the Middle East as Afghanistan was falling? I mean, is that safe?
Is that safe for him? Exactly, yeah.
Right. I mean,
is that a wise decision? Yeah.
Yeah, if you knew it was going to fall, why is that guy traveling?
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe he's traveling because he's working on it in some sense. Maybe he's there because but here's the thing, man. He lies, and what do we do with it? I'm left wondering what's going to happen in a couple of weeks, because we'll comment on his lies right now and we can add them to our long list of lies that presidents tell. And Biden's, of course, not the first. He won't be the last president to lie regularly. But we can add that onto it. But I'm just thinking in the future here. Again, say we get Americans, most/all Americans, successfully evacuated. I think at that point, depending on how soon that happens, Biden's basically in the free and clear. It doesn't matter what horrific images come out of Afghanistan months from now.
Yeah.
Because we gloss over that kind of thing on a daily basis in countries around the world. And even though some would be saying this is supposed to be our responsibility, we broke the pottery, therefore, it's ours. You broke it. You brought it, the pottery bar in Colin Powell rule that we were talking about the other day. Even though some people would be saying that, most people just probably wouldn't pay attention. The media wouldn't really be covering it. Would move on to more attractive and familiar conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know how long they're going to hit him on it. I don't know. I'm conflicted on it. I mean, because there's watching the U.S. lose a war is not something that presidents typically want to be associated with.
No, of course not.
And that's what I mean. This looks horrendous. I mean, to be there for so long, for like 20 years, and then all of a sudden, goes up in smoke. And it's like he's the guy holding the bag. You could be right, though. I mean, media could be like, we have a short memory in this country. I'll put it that way. And so, we'll see how short that memory is. But look, it is possible that they make hay of this and that carries favor. I mean, for example, midterms. Do you think this will have any effect on the midterms at all? Will Republicans be able to make hay and say this is Biden's fault? Like, I guess, I don't know. This is a question mark for me right now.
Pretty darn sure that Trump, well, this is midterms, of course. This is 2024, and it depends on whether or not Trump is running against Biden, assuming both are still, both are running against each other. If that happens, Trump will certainly bring it up.
Yeah.
And I think it'll have some weight then.
Yeah.
But I don't think it'll be as relevant in the midterms.
Okay.
But we'll see, because part of it is that it's like, are you going to use this to hit the Democrats when Pelosi was hitting Biden on pulling out in the way that he did, where, you are getting criticism in these interesting ways. We should have stayed there, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We got to go to a break, though. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, going into our break, coming back in just a minute. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want them recorded.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We are going to go into sports. We have a special guest. We have somewhat of a lighter topic. This week has been pretty heavy in regards to the conversations we've been having, to put it mildly. Everything between COVID and the numbers spiking and the people dying, over 1,000 deaths again, Taliban taking over, women who are believe they're in threat and potentially might be. There's a lot of dark stuff going on. So let's
get into it
for a bit.
We're getting into it. We're
talking some sports. Yeah.
Well, it's still controversial in its own way. We're talking sports and kneeling kneeling during the anthem. And this time, though, we're talking soccer. Let's get into it. We got this headline here. We're going to be getting into this in just a couple minutes, but I'm going to read this now just to set this up. Hope Solo, the former U.S. women's team goalkeeper, has accused star player Megan Rapinoe of bullying her teammates into kneeling during the anthem. Solo also stated that Rapinoe is forcing politics onto the pitch that many of the other players were not on board with. Hope stated, quote, "I think the rhetoric surrounding the team has been both divisive and inclusive. I guess it's kind of where we are in politics in this day and age." End quote. Rapinoe was named one of the country's most influential people by Time magazine. She stated, quote, "For players that are still standing, I would say continue to educate yourself," end quote. So basically, Megan Rapinoe is being a sort of team activist, trying to get people to kneel during the anthem, and people are resistant to this. That's the sort of setup here, right?
According to Hope Solo.
According to Hope
her.
Solo.
And I think it's important to note, number one, it's clear what side of the lane Hope Solo is on. She's clearly not for for kneeling during the anthem. She's made that clear. Also, Megan Rapinoe started kneeling in 2016 with the U.S. women's national team. Hope Solo wasn't on that team. Mm-hmm. She also wasn't on Megan Rapinoe's team in Seattle in the U.S. Soccer League. So her quote is that she's seen Megan Rapinoe force people to kneel, but in actuality, she hasn't been on a roster, the same roster with her. So I don't know if she's seen it. Maybe she's heard it. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I just think I have to take it with a grain of salt, considering I know what side Hope Solo falls on.
Yeah. And when you say you know what side she falls on, explain that, flesh that out a little bit.
She's against the kneeling. She's against that form of protest.
Yeah.
Talking about educate yourself when it comes to kneeling. Well, maybe you should educate yourself on why they're kneeling instead of.
Wait, I thought Megan Rapinoe is the one that said they need to educate.
She is. Rapinoe's the one who said if you're against, if you're still standing, basically. You gotta educate.
Okay.
But
that makes sense.
So
I mean, but that does sound like bullying.
But what's
in a weird way?
What's the maybe? But that's
bully is too strong. But you know what I mean.
What's the issue though? Like, what is it? Black Lives Matter? Is it an extension of last year? Do you know what the actual like?
Well, with her, she is part of the LGBTQ community, and women in soccer, especially politically, has been a huge thing when it comes to the pay. They've been protesting for a while to get the pay that they feel like they deserve. And she started kneeling initially in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick, who was kneeling with the San Francisco 49ers at the time. So that's where her kneeling began in Seattle, where she played for the U.S. soccer team.
Yeah. But eventually became more general.
As it got bigger, and her and Trump had a back and forth a few times. So a part of it was kind of probably to stick it to him realistically on the grand stage. And he still speaks against the U.S. women's national team to this day. So, I mean, it's all of those factors going in. But to say that she bullied anybody, I'm not going to sit here and say that she probably didn't go around the locker room trying to influence people to do it, because it would be more impactful if the entire team did it together.
Exactly.
But there have been instances where not everybody has taken a knee and it's been fine.
Right. No, I understand. I mean, I think it depends. It's like, did she push? Probably. I would be shocked. I mean, just the quote by itself. Oh, you people need to educate yourselves if you're not going to take a knee. It's like,
that's
who are you? Yeah, it's like not everybody is going to want to take a knee. I applaud them for doing so, and I think it's massively courageous for them to do so. And I don't even think I have any issue with them, like this kind of lead by example, where people see what you're doing and they kind of emulate it, that type of thing. But I can kind of see it. I mean, if you squint at it, this notion of the distinction between am I feeling pressured versus am I just asked? And it's like, what is what is this distinction between those things? Is there a way to disambiguate those things? And on some level, no. On some level, yes. On some level, no. I mean, it depends on how extreme it gets, right? I'll come to your house and blow your car up if you don't kneel. That's one way. But also this notion of public pressure, we're trying to get you to do this and you're going to feel some kind of way if you don't. Maybe. I don't know. That's I don't know. I don't see anything wrong with the kneeling, and I don't even see anything wrong with emulation. And like you said, you have to take that stuff on some level with a grain of salt, because it's hard to understand what she specifically means by bully. if that makes sense.
Right.
Does that make sense? Like the distinction between them may be subjective. And so it's hard to kind of hit it that hard of, yes, this is bullying, or no, it's not.
None of her teammates have come out to this point.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
To
I'm
say
inclined to believe
that
it's not.
she has forced them to do something that they didn't want to do.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that there was ever a time where Megan Rapinoe could have gone and just. I mean, what power does she have?
Yeah.
I mean, she doesn't run the
She's got
team.
a platform. She's got a platform. She could coerce people or whatever. She could. If you don't kneel with me, I'm gonna publicly criticize you, but whatever.
Shame you or
And
something
I haven't
like that,
seen
yeah.
any signs of that. But this is just culture war stuff. And I can, again, like Jamarl was kind of getting at, I can see both sides on this. But just setting up the background here. What was the deal with Trump? And what was the deal with the U.S. women's soccer team? I remember hearing about this, but
trashing them or
soccer's not
something,
my
right?
beat. He was
I
trashing
mean, he
them.
calls them un-American.
But why was he doing that? What was
due to the kneeling?
And why were they kneeling at the time? Was this
the
LGBT?
kneeling was a big issue, and even after they had won gold and won a few of the soccer tournaments, people like Megan Rapinoe wouldn't go to the White House to meet. You know, when you win a championship, the team goes to the White House and they have this big ceremony with the president. A lot of them weren't going, so Trump is like, forget you then. I don't need you. And from that point on, and she stood on the side of Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah.
And Trump is big on bashing Colin Kaepernick for his kneeling. So it really became a war of words from there, and it's continued on. When the women's soccer team struggled during the Olympics, Trump was one of the first people to bring that up.
Here's one more thing, which is, Jamarl, you were earlier saying that it's brave. I don't know if it's brave for Megan Rapinoe. Colin Kaepernick's another thing because he was the first one to do it. But at this point, Colin Kaepernick became like a cultural moment. He became an icon. People hated, people loved. You had this conversation around what he was doing. Yeah. And in that sense, he was the first to do it. Therefore, he was brave. He was taking a serious risk. Other people, I think that conversation, even though people will still criticize Kaepernick, and even though in sports, clearly there are deep divisions in how people view what he did and kneeling for the anthem in general, it's like he was the first one to do it. I don't see Rapinoe, not Rapinoe. I don't see Rapinoe, what she's doing, nearly as brave. And if she's trying to get her if she's trying to get her teammates to do it too, it might be noble. It might be a good thing. Yeah. But brave casts her in a light where it's like, oh, she's taken all these risks. But she's seen what's happened, which is you get some flack, you deal with some difficulty, but broadly.
Colin Kaepernick was basically blacklisted from the sport for God knows how long. I mean, it's
true, but then it came around. That's my thing. And so isn't she
he playing football?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think he was.
But here's the sense that I've gotten. The sense that I've gotten is that largely our culture is like accepted what Colin Kaepernick has done, and that, as we see with Rapinoe, a lot of other people have started to imitate him. They've accepted what he's done, and you created this wave. My point being, Rapinoe, depending on when she did it, I don't know. It just doesn't seem like she's taking serious risks there. It seems like people are willing to accept that kind of thing. It's just standing up to the government, which, people are doing more and more these days.
They may be willing to accept in the abstract, but the reality of it is Kaepernick is still not working. I mean, it's like people would be like, okay, fair enough. You won the argument. It's like, okay, can you get a guy a job? No. It hurts our bottom line. It's that stuff. I still think it's risk. You may not think it's as risky, and that's fair. But I do think it tells risk.
Rapinoe's still playing. So
yes,
technically,
she is.
it wasn't nearly as risky.
Yeah.
Technically,
not nearly as risky for her. No, as risky as it was for Colin, for sure. I mean, he was the first one to do it.
I guess that's what I'm saying, is that the brave thing, it's easy to throw around brave,
Right.
like, oh, anybody who makes this kind of decision is brave. But at a certain point, when you see person after person doing it, granted, he got out and he's not playing again. So her looking at that, she's like, I might be taking a risk. But it wasn't a...
Well, she
didn't
did
lose
start doing it in 16. Now, people are more open to it
now,
recently.
yeah.
But in 16, it was still, rubbing everybody. I'm not going to say everybody, but it was rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. And people still weren't receptive to that form of messaging at the time as much as they are now. And people still don't like it.
They still don't like it because in their heads, I don't come to sports to watch a protest.
Right. Yeah.
That's what often people say.
Yeah.
And, from the sports person, though, it's like, yeah, I get that, but, carrying a pigskin matters far less than people getting shot in the streets or some kind of disadvantage in regards to society. So, I get that point. I don't know. I do think it tells risk.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I just add on to that because I can empathize with it too. It's like, these are people, what do you want from us? As if I were an athlete. Do you just want us to use our bodies for your amusement? Or can I have a voice? Can I have a perspective too? Like you treat me like a celebrity. You treat me like I matter in some sense. But when I start to speak up, you ignore me. And I
But
guess
that's the thing. It's about what side of the aisle the athlete falls on.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's an athlete that comes out now and is like, keep the politics out of sports, keep the protesting off the field.
Yeah.
It'll be a certain crowd that's okay with that. That'll cheer that on. But on the flip side, it's going to be a certain crowd that's going to endorse the people that's protesting. So it just matters of what the audience, whatever that particular audience is looking for at the time, what fits the narrative that they already believe in. Because it's a UFC fighter that was pro-Trump. His name is leaving me right now, but he was at the time. Trump is big on keeping politics out of sport, but this guy wins a fight and he gets on a FaceTime call with Trump right after the fight, and they're having their whole political back and forth, like all this, patriotism and all that kind of stuff, and it's cool. It's okay then, but if you're not speaking what they want to hear at the time, they want to shut you up.
Yeah.
And, that's the problem. If you're going to, my thing is, if you're going to accept one thing, accept it all. Yeah. Accept it all. Understand that these people are human beings. They're not just there to have for your entertainment. Right. Yes, they're paid millions of dollars, but these people have insight, and they do come from certain backgrounds that are always pretty.
Yeah. True. One more thing from Austin that I want to throw in because it's just relevant. The team, I'm quoting, the team redesigned their warm-up uniforms to have Black Lives Matter right on the front and removed the United and America. It just says states. The Black Lives Matter states.
Interesting.
The women's national team?
Apparently.
Wow.
So is that a bridge too far? Or is that just like we were just talking about? Is that just politics? Is that just their decision?
That sounds a bit much. I don't know. I mean, like, it's one thing to say, hey, we get you to kneel. I mean, it's the U.S. soccer team, right?
Yeah.
And they're removing the U.S. from the soccer team jersey?
Because that starts to be like abusing your station a little bit or something like that. But I don't know. It's like, okay, our government, our country, we put you here to do something, and now you're going to use that, I don't know.
To stick it to us.
Yeah. To stick it to us.
It's just very strange. I get the protest.
That's definitely a tad over the top.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a little too in your face to the country.
I mean, because it is the U.S. soccer team.
Right.
Like this, it's not like, it's the Afghani soccer team. It's the United States soccer team. And it's like whatever vagaries, issues associated with the country, all sorts of problems. By the same token, it is the U.S. soccer team. It feels weird to remove, acts as if that's not true. I mean, it is what it is. And
isn't there something, I mean, I know there's bits about burning the flag, and that's controversial to say the least, but like, isn't there something American about like free speech and doing what you want, even if you're supposed to be there? People know who you're playing for. Right. But like, if seeing these women compete, it's like, isn't there something uniquely American about being able to turn your back on America very publicly, speak out against it, criticize it, that kind of thing?
Well, yes. And nobody's stopping me from doing that.
Yeah.
And I think even in the conversation we were having, we didn't have any issue with them speaking out against it. It just feels over the top to remove the United States from the United States jersey.
Yeah.
It just feels very weird.
I mean, it's pretty disrespectful.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't usually say that when it comes to the protest, but I mean that is a little disrespectful. You're there representing the country. I'm not saying don't protest or whatever the form is, but to completely like try to distance yourself from the country.
It's like, I don't want to represent this country.
Yeah.
Which is strange since you're there representing the country.
Right.
It's like, which one is it? Are you ashamed of the country or, which one is it? It feels a little,
But was it, but here's the thing, and I'm not even devil's advocate. Interesting conversation. But was Colin Kaepernick disrespectful when he kneeled? I mean, very simply, how isn't that technically disrespectful?
No, he's on a football league. And look, like you said, we had no issue with the protests. Like, even in the conversation here, it was like, okay, yeah, fair enough. No issue with the protests. If you want to kneel, great. But it seems different.
It's like wearing it, but what is it with wearing a different shirt? Why is that
No, it's not just a shirt. It's like burning a flag in a weird way. It's like, is burning a flag just burning cloth?
I got that. I see it too. I'm just, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, the Colin situation, I think is totally different because he decided to kneel during the national anthem, but that's not the same as
representing the United States.
Yeah, and taking the flag, the name off of your jersey and replacing it with the name of a movement.
Yeah.
That Colin Kaepernick protest, I felt like was pretty good. I mean, I don't know what else you could want. I mean, that's the definition of a peaceful protest, and it pretty much cost him his livelihood at the time. But everybody wanted peaceful protests, and you got it, and it just wasn't in the form you like to see.
And by the way, he didn't push.
He
didn't cajole.
Anything.
He didn't attack.
Didn't say a word.
He just went out and kneel. And, you know, it's like, I mean, what else? You know what I mean? It's like, he's not, hey, you guys need to educate yourself if you don't kneel with me. It was none of that. This is my silent protest.
Well, okay, and following up on this real quick, these claims, these are dating back years, right? So we're now hearing Hope Solo accuse Rapinoe of this stuff. But like the point is, the claims that she's making would include things that Rapinoe would have been doing years ago, like 5 years ago, back in 2016, starting out with this stuff, right?
Yeah, and that's why it's kind of throwing me off, like, the fact that she's saying that she saw it.
Yeah.
Not that she heard it from a teammate or anything like that. The fact that she's saying that she saw it is the one thing that's throwing me off. And if you did see it, why are you the only one to say it 5 years later? Yeah. And why are you just bringing it up 5 years later? I mean, this has been going on for a while now. What all of a sudden sparked it today for you to bring it up? But that's just me. Cause I'm not gonna lie. Considering I know her stance on the matter, it makes me believe her a little less. But I just felt like I would have heard that, somebody would have made a statement about this by now.
We've got a caller.
Okay,
Talk
real quick.
Calling about this topic.
ESPN used to never touch the stuff. I mean, I remember SportsCenter politics was just not a part of it. Like, it was completely separate and distinct. People like Michael Jordan, people like Magic Johnson, none of that stuff used to be part of politics. And it's pretty heady for me to be in this kind of place now where that doesn't seem to be true.
But there's so I agree with you on the one hand, but like also Muhammad Ali, there are a couple of examples that do stick out.
Yeah,
like these were definitely political figures, but they stick out, and maybe I'm thinking of it because those are the exceptions that prove the rule. Those are the people in a remarkably apolitical time where, like, I'm going to say something with this, you know?
But let's go to the calls.
We got callers. We're taking, I suppose we're taking more. If you want to talk about this, 202-521-1320 is the phone number you can call if you want to join this open conversation we're having. Let's go to Javante, calling in from Virginia. I hope I pronounced that right. Javante, you're on. What's on your mind?
Yes, you did. You're correct with that. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm a long-time listener and a big fan of the shows. My first time calling.
Thanks, man.
A little nervous. Jamal?
Don't be nervous.
Okay. You cracked me up with that one, the rules are the rules. That really, I love that. I love your
Oh, the video. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. This Biden's when he said rules are rules. And then it's like, but they weren't for his crackhead son, when he was putting people in prison. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, don't put people in a drinking contest when you use that term because they'll be laid out within the first minute. That's a bad joke. Sorry. But with the Colin Kaepernick situation, he took advice from a military, individual from military that actually gave him that idea to take a knee, to protest. So when people bring up, you're disrespecting the flag, you're disrespecting the military, no one ever brings up the fact that he got the idea from someone that was in the military, and to be the most respectful manner to protest, which would be silently and with, he's not like raising a fist, he's not doing anything, he's just taking a knee. And if people actually read what he's protesting through the anthem, and if anyone reads the anthem in the full version of the American the anthem, there's a clause about the blood flowing in the streets of the hirelings, which were at that time enslaved individuals. So that's taken out of the anthem when it's staying in stadiums and at football games, but that's something that is never talked about and people don't bring up, and that's why some people don't care about the anthem. That's pretty much. Well, also I did see the Ragnarok record of Ragnarok, and it's pretty good as well, Jamal.
It's like Marvel TV show or something.
Yeah. No. This was it was an anime that my wife turned me on to, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah.
But it was really, really good.
I remember you telling me about that. Cool.
Yeah. But thank you, man. I appreciate it. What are your thoughts? I remember that. Now that you brought that up, I remember it was a military guy that gave him the advice.
And it shouldn't matter, but white military guy again shouldn't matter, but like
he's absolutely right. And I want to emphasize that's what happens when people are just grasping at straws to try to change the narrative. Everybody else made it about the military.
Yeah.
Colin Kaepernick had never said a word about the military. In fact, he actually mentioned how in solidarity he is with the military, and how he also mentioned how he got the idea from the military guy, but also how the military are the ones who fought for him. It was never about disrespecting the military or whatever. But people just love to associate the flag with the military as if that's the only thing that it represents. It's not. And it was just, I felt like a way for them to get away from the actual point of why he's actually protesting. It's easy to just create a whole separate narrative and then to actually deal with the problem at hand.
They could have just asked him.
Which they did, and he mentioned, but they didn't care.
Yeah.
They truly did not care. All they wanted to talk about was how it was disrespectful to the military and to the country, not exactly what the root of the problem is.
Do you think that that's modus operandi going forward? And this is for both of you guys. This notion of, let's go to college.
Two callers. Yeah, it would have been a good question. But Michael from Sydney, talking about this. Michael, you're on. What's going on?
Yeah. Hey, guys. I just wanted to say, first of all, what happened to Colin Kaepernick was an absolute disgrace. Secondly, I'm old enough to remember, not through actually seeing it, but through being 34, nearly 35, 44, nearly 45 now, in the Mexico Olympics, when the two black sprinters stood with their fists in the air as civil rights protest. If you look at the anti-war movement in America during the Vietnam War, people were burning their draft cards, which is an official government document, and they were also burning the American flag, right? And then you look at the 2000 Olympics here in Australia, where our sprinter, Cathy Freeman, won the 400 metres. She was an Aboriginal, and I think this is probably the correct way to do it. She ran with both an Aboriginal flag and an Australian flag. She ran with both of them around the track as a victory lap. And Cathy Freeman did more in that moment to unite this country and the Aboriginal people than anybody else had done in history of Aboriginal people in Australia. It was one of the most watched sporting events in Australia. She was under so much pressure, and people here were crying. There were European people who were probably racist people crying at Cathy Freeman running around with the Australian and the Aboriginal flag. It's one of the proudest sporting moments in Australian history that I've ever seen. And I think if you're going to protest your country at an official, something like the Olympics, you can't remove the name of your country off your team. You're there representing them. But there's nothing wrong with protesting. The image of those two black sprinters in America and Mexico in 1974 or whenever it was, with their fists raised in the air, is one of the iconic civil rights movement, images of the century. And, and the people burning the American flag in protest of the Vietnam War on their draft cards, and that's history. They're some of the most powerful images in history of anti-war and civil rights movements around the world.
Robert McNamara talks about a guy coming to his office door, setting himself on fire in front of his office. And the guy was doing it to protest the Vietnam War. And in this kind of odd way, his point was, look, I'm not going to injure anybody else, but I wanted to get it clear. And the thing of value that I can get across that strongly is my own person. That stuff is rough.
Michael, thank you for the call. Anthony, you got maybe 45 seconds here. Anthony calling in from Detroit. You're on. What's on your mind?
Good morning, guys. I think Michael brought up a good point there with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. And I think it was the 68 Olympics year my mother was born, actually. I would just take it even further. I think if you guys, don't find it distasteful, the idea of removing anything United States affiliated from apparel, I think black people should boycott the Olympics entirely and see what it looks like with no black person running for any Western country, performing for any Western country whatsoever.
It'd be ugly.
Look like
it'd be ugly. That basketball team would be really ugly. I could assure you of that.
Bring a lot of attention to the real moves that we need to make in order to establish alternatives to the superstructures that perpetuate the system that is based on genocide that continues today of people in the global south, in Africa, and right here domestically. We need to come to terms, reckon with it. It is genocide that's committed on black people, indigenous people.
Anthony, we got to close here. We're out of time. Thank you for the call. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would strongly imply that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Great last segment. Shout out to Cordell. Thank you, man. And I was telling Shane, it sounded like we need a sports segment. I don't typically watch sports like talking about, by the same token, it is so immersive and easy to kind of engage and to have these kind of longer conversations. It's almost like good and bad in comic books. Like it snapshots it in a way where everybody can talk about it and everybody can go back and forth with it. Now, that was a great segment. I enjoy it. But let's get into the headlines. In the news, about 162,724 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 1,128 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 140,893 cases per day, an increase of 47% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and at least 60% of residents at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 37,296,398 human beings across the United States and has killed that much more unfortunate 624,365 human beings in America. A new study by JAMA Pediatrics, Journal of American Medicine, Medical Association, Pediatrics, has concluded that babies and toddlers are more likely than teens to transmit coronavirus. While teens are more likely to get infected with COVID-19, those 0 to 3-year-olds were more likely to transmit the virus. Very, very interesting. There was also a report that came out yesterday in the New York Times, and it was making the point, this is right here, breakthrough infections in vaccinated people account for at least 1 in 5 of the newly diagnosed cases in one of 6 states. And a higher percentage of hospitalizations and deaths than had been previously observed in all of them, according to the New York Times. So basically, 4 in 5 are still, who are getting it are still unvaccinated. 1 in 5 new vaccinations, at the very least in the new states, are of the vaccinated, and that number is, of course, going up. So Delta, Lambda, et cetera, and what comes after it. And these guys are talking about a booster vaccine.
And then there's this argument over the booster that we might want to come back to, too.
Yeah. This question on, what about the rest of the world and that type of stuff. Yeah. But let's keep going. In a speech with ABC News yesterday, President Biden said the chaos was inevitable as America withdrew from Afghanistan. We actually have that clip from Stephanopoulos. Andre, can you load it? I'll come back to it in a few. But yeah, in the clip, he's having a conversation with Stephanopoulos. And in the interview, he's asked point blank, was this a failure of intelligence or was this a failure of planning? And Biden basically said this was inevitable. Let's go ahead and play the clip.
When you look at what's happened over the last week, was it a failure of intelligence, planning, execution, or judgment?
Look, I don't think it was a failure. Look, it was a simple choice, George. When the Taliban, let me back it, put it another way. When you had the government of Afghanistan, the leader of that government getting in a plane and taking off and going to another country, when you saw the significant collapse of the Afghan troops we had trained, up to 300,000 of them, just leaving their equipment and taking off, that was, that's what happened. That's simply what happened.
But we've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
What did you think when you first saw those pictures?
What I thought was we have to gain control of this. We have to move this more quickly. We have to move in a way in which we can take control of that airport. And we did.
So you don't think this could have been handled, this actually could have been handled better in any way? No mistakes?
No, I don't think it could have been handled in a way that we're going to go back in hindsight and look, but the idea that somehow there's a way to have gotten out without chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens. I don't know how that happened.
No, George.
So for you, that was always priced into the decision?
Yes.
Yeah, no, George, I didn't do anything wrong. It was always planned to be this way. But people were hanging out of airplanes. That was 4 days ago, George. That was 4 days ago. Why do you keep bringing up 4 days ago? That's amazing. That's an amazing clip. I don't. This is a momentous display of trying to save face and failing at it like nobody's business. And, you know, we even recounted the story earlier today from NPR, from the National Review, where they were talking about potentially going back into the country right here. At the end of Wednesday's press conference, Dan Lamuth of the Washington Post asked Miley if the military is considering retaking Bagram. Miley, good question, great question, but I'm not going to discuss branches and sequels of our current operation. You left Bagram. It was more defensible and it had 2 airports. Now you're talking about potentially going back. This is not a display of competence. This is not a display of competence. Let's keep going. The city comptroller for New York City, Scott Stringer, released an explosive report yesterday highlighting the city's failures to prepare for and respond to the pandemic, saying the city's initial response to COVID was hampered by lack of planning, coordination, and preparedness across the city government. Chief among the findings was a long-term failure by the city government to plan for a pandemic, relying instead on nearly 8-year-old drafted plan, never finished, to respond to the virus. The plan didn't contain details on obtaining medical supplies during a crisis, distributing them, or when schools should be closed and reopened. Stringer said the 30-page review included only his office's initial findings because City Hall has consistently fought its subpoenas for documents from the health department, public hospital system, and the mayor's office. Yesterday, the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Texas law effectively banning second-time or second trimester abortions. The decision marks the first time a U.S. federal court has upheld a prohibition on standard abortion methods. Those who violate the law can face up to 2 years in prison. The Biden Justice Department has warned Missouri lawmakers about a new gun bill passed in the state, saying the bill would violate federal laws. The bill bars state and local officials from enforcing any laws or actions that violate Missourian Second Amendment rights, which the DOJ argues is an attempt to supersede federal laws, saying it, quote, purports to nullify certain federal firearm laws, prohibit enforcement of those federal firearm laws, and impose civil monetary penalties on political subdivisions and state law enforcement agencies that enforce or assist in the enforcement of those federal firearm laws, unquote. And in a story that we talked about earlier, first segment actually quite good, Hope Solo, former U.S. women's team goalkeeper, has accused star player Megan Rapinoe of bullying her teammates into kneeling during the anthem. Solo also stated that Rapinoe is forcing politics onto the pitch that many other players were not on board with. Hope said, quote, I think the rhetoric surrounding the team has been both divisive and inclusive. I guess it's kind of where we are in politics in this day and age, unquote. Rapinoe was named one of the country's most influential people by Time magazine. She stated, quote, for players that are still standing, I would say continue to educate yourself, unquote. Because of course, being uneducated is the only reason why they will be standing, by extension of that logic. Joe Biden announced that he is directing all nursing homes to require their staff to get vaccinated. The president stated, quote, now, if you visit, live, or work at a nursing home, you should not be at a high risk of contracting COVID from unvaccinated employees. While I'm mindful that my authority at the federal level is limited, I'm going to continue to look for ways to keep people safe and increase vaccination rates, unquote. Additionally, Biden is directing Education Secretary Miguel Cardona to enact a similar policy regarding schools. We actually have that clip also. Andre, I'm going to actually bring that clip up and I'll come back to that in a moment. The United States Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, fielded questions from reporters yesterday, during which they declared the airport in Kabul secure and said that evacuation flights were ongoing, saying that the plan to evacuate all American citizens and as many Afghan allies as possible. They repeatedly did not answer questions about how they could ensure American evacuations. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets of Afghanistan yesterday in a rebellious display against the Taliban. The protesters were celebrating the country's independence from Britain in 1919 by removing Taliban flags and replacing them with the national standard flag. In response, the Taliban fired into the air and the crowd, trying to get them to disperse. Some people on the ground said that they've been beaten up by Taliban fighters, and several died in cities of Ashabadad, Khost, and Jalalabad. The death count in Haiti's 7.5 earthquake has risen to 2,189 human beings. 12,268 have been hospitalized and 332 are still missing, according to Haiti Office of Civil Protection. They also stated that 600,000 people are in need of humanitarian assistance and 135,000 families are displaced. The United States has deployed troops and other personnel to assist the country, including the warship USS Arlington, which will arrive tomorrow. Persephone, a fully autonomous robot, is being employed as a tour guide in Greece's Alistri Cave. Touted as the world's first robot tour guide, Persephone covers 500 feet before a human takes over and is capable of giving a guide in 33 languages. She can also answer 33 different questions, but all in Greek. Persephone is clearly named after the Greek goddess who was kidnapped by the god of the underworld, whom she spent half of her life with. And last, a startup for RepairSmith has raised $42 million in funding to begin a new service of traveling car mechanics. The customer will be able to book an appointment online for an inspection or repair of the vehicle, and the mechanic will come right to the door for the service. The company is growing out of Mercedes' incubator program after seeing success there and is expanding into the greater market. That's a great idea. Those are your headlines. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Andre, let's play that clip from Biden having a conversation about basically pushing people in various nursing homes to get vaccinated.
Today, I'm announcing a new step. If you work in a nursing home and serve people on Medicare or Medicaid, you will also be required to get vaccinated. More than 130,000 residents in nursing homes have had, sadly, over the period of this virus, passed away. At the same time, vaccination rates among nursing home staff significantly trail the rest of the country. The studies show that highly vaccinated nursing home staff is associated with at least 30% less COVID-19 cases among long-term care residents. With this announcement, I'm using the power of the federal government as a payer of health care costs to ensure we reduce those risks to our most vulnerable seniors. These steps are all about keeping people safe and out of harm's way. If you walk into a government office building, you should know that federal workers are doing everything possible to keep you safe. If you're a veteran seeking care at a VA hospital, you should not be at a greater risk walking into the hospital than you were outside the hospital. And now, if you visit, live, or work in a nursing home, you should not be at a high risk for contracting COVID from unvaccinated employees.
I am so conflicted on that. I understand his point, and I get what he's trying to accomplish, and I get the idea of, many of the people who are going to be in those nursing homes are at the weakest end of the pool, meaning, they're the ones who are most likely to die. I mean, we saw the nursing home thing with Cuomo, where you had, 40% or some insane percentage of the deaths came out of 1% of the population. And even among the residents of the country, you still had a very high, 48% of the people ended up being like older or something? Like the numbers were very, very stark in regards to the people who were dying that were older. So I get his logic and I get the argument. There are two strains of thought with this. This is existential for Joe Biden. That's the first point. Meaning, I don't think in his head he conceived of being in August and is still having numbers of 1,000 people dying a day. I don't think that was ever part of the calculus for him. I think in his head, he thought people are going to get the vaccines. We're going to, open the businesses. I'm going to pass my healthcare thing. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. And that is decidedly not what happened. And so now you end up in this weird spot where you're getting very muscular and heavy-handed in the way that you're going about doing this stuff. And whereas, you know, you may get half the public saying, okay, fair enough. And especially people who are vaccinated, people who are vaccinated have a much higher propensity to be like, well, yeah, they should do X or they should do Y. I am concerned of a certain backlash, but the backlash can't be enough of a reason for you not to do X or to do Y. I don't know. It feels like we're in an unfortunate spot. That's all. And, you know, to end up with the solution of like, okay, well, we'll just get a booster. It's like, a booster? This looks like we just got the vaccines. And now we're already on our third? And so what does this mean, fourth? And it feels very weird to be in a spot where it seems like that's the only thing they banked on. Like there was nothing else. Like when he gets in, it's like in their heads, it's, okay, we're going to do vaccines. That's it. And it's like, okay, well, what happens if they start losing efficacy? What do you mean? What I just asked you. What happens if they start losing efficacy? I mean, are you passing out vitamin D? Are you trying to make certain other things a little bit more available? Are you good? Like, what is your plan of action? And I think the honest, sad, uncomfortable truth is there isn't one. I don't believe they're going to lock down anymore, even if it went out of control. It seems that even though this is still largely a disease of the vaccinated or the unvaccinated, that number is still going up in regards to the people who are vaccinated. And in the same sense that there was a breakthrough for this, there's no reason to believe that with a large segment of the public that doesn't want to get vaccinated or doesn't want to do masks or doesn't want to do any of this stuff, that it's not going anywhere. It's unfortunate. I've known people from day one that didn't have the opportunity to not work, that were at risk from early on, even when there were like shortages of masks and everything else. My mom-in-law works at a hospital, older. Her life at risk, freaked out. She's having conversations with her kids, kind of letting them know, like, look, if anything happens, et cetera, et cetera. Because, again, she works at a hospital. She has to deal with people who are sick. And this is when people were dropping dead, like 5,000 people a day. And so it's like when all of this stuff first started to change over and tweak over, it's like if I deal every other day with people who are immunocompromised, people who are much, much older, all of them at risk, meaning if any of them get sick, all of them die. And you have this kind of weird bifurcation of your society that way. It is greatly unfortunate for me to see this number go up like this, because I know that all of those people are back into this notion of, oh my God, I could potentially die. It's unfortunate. That's all.
It's true. On a completely unrelated note, because
go for it.
You've been talking for
No, go for it.
No, you're good. 3 polls are sort of statistical things. I think these are all polls. These are all polls. 1, Biden's approval rating has sunk to a new low.
Mm-hmm.
So that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
2, roughly 2/3 of Americans, according to an AP NORC poll, say they don't think the war in Afghanistan was worth fighting, which is reassuring and to be expected, I think.
Yeah.
About that ratio, that seems about right. And then 3rd, this was one that you brought to my attention the other day. I believe it was a Pew Research poll on American judgments of misinformation, where it was something like 48% of Americans were willing to accept abrogating free speech if it meant combating disinformation. In other words, they were willing to let their free speech rights go as long as the articles that said things that were untrue were erased from their timelines.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I'm trying to find the exact number, but it was like 48%, if I'm not mistaken, where they were perfectly willing to... Yeah, here it is. Yeah, 48% basically were willing to restrict certain liberties. Roughly half of U.S. adults, 48%, say the government should take steps to restrict false information online, even if it means losing some freedom to access and publish content. And that's up from 39% in 2018.
Disgusting. I hope that polling is wrong. I hope that this is one of those biased, deceptive polls.
I don't think it is. I think, because if you think about it, break it up in political ideology for a moment. You get Democrats who are probably going to be like, yeah, take the information down. Because they were fully in the camp of take it down, I don't want it up, et cetera. If I don't like it, it's disinformation, et cetera. You have independents who tend to, float in the middle somewhere, and conservatives tend to be on the other side of it.
Hey, I don't float in the middle somewhere, Jamarl. I've got a left wing and a right wing, and that's how I fly.
You know what I mean. I'm just talking about in the polling of it. I don't think it's, I suspect that you probably have a large percentage of Democrats that says, yes, take this stuff down.
Yeah.
That's so unfortunate. So unfortunate. It's like a ministry of truth. We'll accept the ministry of truth as long as you give her the stuff that I don't like. Amazing. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming back with a great conversation with Vijay Prashad on Afghanistan in the beginning when it had a chance. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We have a great guest, and I'm just going to go into the guest, Vijay Prashad, because this was a conversation that came up earlier where he put out a tweet. He basically, and I'll just read it. Today, as the Taliban begins to take Kabul and therefore all of Afghanistan, I am thinking of my friend and comrade, Anita Rebetz, who would have been the country's democratic president if imperialism had not pushed the Mujahideen and therefore the Taliban to power. And I thought this conversation in regards to what could Afghanistan have been if it wasn't this kind of relic of the Cold War, if it wasn't a pawn on the piece of a chessboard of the Cold War. And so I'm glad that my guest could join us, Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and a non-resident fellow at Chaoyang Institute for Financial Studies at Richmond University in China. Vijay, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. This tweet I found phenomenal because I often try to tell people, I've heard people say, oh, Afghanistan has always been that way. The Middle East has always been that way. And my head was like, nonsense. It wasn't always that way. There was a history to this stuff where things could have been somewhat different, a sliding door universe, meaning Afghanistan did not have to turn into this chessboard or this, this pawn in the chess war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Can you go into the history of Afghanistan, specifically around the time of Anita Rebetz, where they had the potential to be a democratic country?
Yeah, the first thing to say is that Afghanistan has faced external threats and been part of the so-called Great Game for a very long time. I mean, in the 19th century, the British government believed that Afghanistan was the battlefield against the advance of Tsarist Russian, forces and so on. And Britain several times tried to invade Afghanistan, including as recently as 100 years ago in 1919. And each of those attempts by the British to go and seize power in Afghanistan had an impact. I mean, they pushed a certain elite into power, and they did hold the country at times. It's incorrect to say that Britain lost all those wars, and I very much dislike that phrase, the graveyard of empires, because the Afghan people, of course, fought for their sovereignty then, but they were also undermined by British imperialism. Nonetheless, in 1919, a pretty liberal monarch came to power, Amanullah Khan. And subsequent to that, from 1919 till about 1992, 1991, there was a real dynamic, a real attempt to bring social development and change, transformations of one kind or the other into Afghan society. In 1964, there was a constitution, and then another one in 1973. Both of these constitutions were pretty liberal. They were driven by sections of the liberal monarchy. There was enormous influence by middle-class liberal sections in Kabul, but also the development of the communist movement had an impact In 1965, there was the creation of the Democratic Women's Organization, which was led by the woman who I mentioned in that tweet, Anahita Ratevzad. Anahita was a very important figure in the Afghan women's movement, in the Afghan left movement. And in 1960s, she was one of the first people to enter the Afghan parliament, she and 3 other women of different political backgrounds. They drove a very important agenda on behalf of simple issues. You know, that's the other thing. Child marriage to be abolished, the right of divorce, the right of women to go to work, and importantly, the right for women's education. This was something that they pushed very hard in the 1960s and 70s. When the left-wing government came to power in April 1978, Anahita Ratevzad became the Minister of Social Affairs. And under this government, it essentially pushed an agenda for literacy, for women's emancipation in the family. Now, this is important, literacy. They started an enormous literacy campaign. I mean, Afghan literacy rates were in the teens at that time. So it was very important to have a major literacy campaign, and that's what they did. They pushed the agenda for the abolition of child marriage, a very important issue in many parts of the world. You know, you can't have social development if girls are getting married at the age of 5 or 6 or 8 or whatever. So that was abolished by decree. Now, in Pakistan, you had the development of a very right-wing, very conservative group of Afghans who had gone into exile, who passed, you know, their own decrees saying that, no, child marriage should be allowed, girls should not go to school, and so on. And these are the people that the United States backed, this so-called Mujahideen, sitting in Peshawar, sitting in Waziristan, in Pakistan. They were backed by the United States to go back and fight. And what they started doing, and this is very significant, the first attacks that these people made in the countryside in Afghanistan was to go and assassinate rural literacy workers. There was carnage of rural literacy workers. That was the beginning, in a sense, of the war against decency in Afghanistan. And it's as the US increasingly backed this Mujahideen to go and fight an agenda against literacy and so on, it's at that point that the government in Kabul asked the Soviet Union to intervene and assist them. If you read the Soviet debates over whether they should intervene in Afghanistan, it's very instructive. The Soviets go in reluctantly. They didn't want to enter Afghanistan. They felt that this would be a disaster, and in fact, it was a disaster. You know, it was quite catastrophic because they just, the entry of the Soviets across the Amu Darya inflamed, gave the Mujahideen now a cause to rally around even more firmly. They sort of came out and said, well, we're again fighting the British. It was a completely different context, you know, completely different politics. But this is what the United States did. This is what President Jimmy Carter did. They stood on the side of people who don't want girls to have education, who want girls to marry at the age of 6, and women like Anahita Ratevzad had to go into exile.
And that puts the entire narrative about regime change, not just being for, you know, serving our geopolitical purposes, but being an accommodating, benevolent attempt at nation building, where we're trying to raise their cultural level. Well, looking at what we did, it's very clear that that wasn't our purpose. That was something we put on to adorn our purpose later on, partway through this process. But we also, I'm really grateful, and first of all, really good talking with you, Vijay. You just gave an excellent layout of the history here. Can we go back and just briefly lay out the sort of political bodies, the different states of Afghanistan as they existed during these different periods of time? So you mentioned there was the period of not British rule, but British subjugation, effectively, during the late 19th into the early 20th centuries. Then you have monarchy that is eventually, over a couple of kings, maybe 50 years later, replaced by a republic. I'm glossing over this incredibly, and I'm going to rely on you to fill in some of the details. That republic exists for a couple of years. Then you have a socialist government, and that's sort of what sets us up with the Mujahideen, what's happening in the late 80s, mid-80s, early 90s, that whole period. Is that broadly right? And, you know, just setting this up for people who don't know much about the history of Afghanistan, can you fill in some of the blanks there? What should we know about it to set us up understanding where they're coming from, recent history? BJ.
Well, for our purposes, let's ignore everything from before the Mujahideen, because the fact of the matter is all that needs to be said of the period before that, and I'm talking about from when Abdul Rahman Khan takes over as the monarch in 1880. From about 1880 to roughly 1980, for 100 years, Afghanistan is on a very serious journey of social reform. I'm including in this the civil law that's passed in 1977, a civil law which, people who have good sensitive feeling would say that, well, that's a perfectly decent law. Basically, what is the civil law? It says something like that women can't marry till they're 16. That's Article 70. Article 80 gives adult women the right to enter marriage without seeking the permission of their guardian, as it were. Adult women, why should they seek their guardian's permission? These are basic, decent things, that are there in our human development. And by the way, I said this is the civil law of 1977. It was passed a year before, or several months before the communists came to power in April of 1978. It's not true that the communists pushed some sort of alien agenda in Afghanistan. It's totally untrue. From 1880 to about 1980, there was one history of Afghanistan, which was to push forward a kind of civilized attitude to human life. You see, in Peshawar, in Pakistan, in the refugee camps, something quite different was going on. There you had, a drive not to allow girls to study. A study was done, by the way, in Pakistan, in the refugee camps in 1986, asking about education, and what they found was 41% of refugee children had some kind of schooling. By the way, some kind of schooling, not like a full 12 years of secondary school, but some kind of schooling. And among all the refugee children that were surveyed, 41% went to school. Only 5% of the people in school were girls. There were actually, decrees passed by the leaders of this so-called Mujahideen that said that, girls should not be educated. In fact, one decree had a very curious language. It said this is not the right time for women and girls to become educated. And women and girls, or particularly women who worked in humanitarian organizations, non-government organizations in Pakistan, were being attacked, acid thrown on their faces and so on for going to work. This is not the Taliban. I'm talking about 1986. I'm talking about 1990, where Fatima Yasir, who was the president of the Islamic Organization of Afghan Women, the total opposite of Anahita Ratebzad, basically gave a speech, public speech, where she said that, women should not go and get educated. But yes, if women are going to work, let them work along the lines of Islamic law. By the way, when I heard the Taliban representatives two days ago talk about women can work, but they must follow Islamic law, I was reminded of Fatima Yasir's statement made in 1990. There are two histories of Afghanistan. There's the history of Anahita Ratebzad, which says that Afghan women must have the right to live in dignity, in fellowship with others and so on. And there's the history of Fatima Yasir. These are two histories of Afghanistan, two competing histories. And the United States backed the history of Fatima Yasir, the history of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the history of Buruddin Rabbani, the history of the Taliban. That's where the US stands. The US has stood with that history from at least 1979 to the present. And that's shameful. People in the United States should be ashamed of where they stood for these last 50 years, at least in the sector of Afghanistan.
BJ, from your standpoint, just your reading of history of all of this, you are aware of what the Taliban government was in Afghanistan prior. After all, they didn't have the entirety of the country. But like you said, the representative that came out recently saying women are going to be able to work within the context of Islamic law. I heard that, and I thought to myself, well, when they were basically, shooting women in soccer stadiums, that was also probably the frame of reference. Meaning, when you see what's taking place now, what do you think is going to happen? Do you have this notion that this is a more modernized, whatever that means, Taliban? Or is this, same old, just different packaging propaganda? What do you think is true here? in regards to, the intentions of running the country?
Well, the first thing to say is that although many of the senior leaders of the Taliban were there as original students, I mean, the word Taliban, ironically, by the way, means student. These were original students in the Pakistani refugee camps. Mullah Baradar, for instance, has been at this game since the early 1990s. He's the man who led the negotiations in Doha, Qatar. He's just returned to Kabul. It's likely that he will be the head of their government and so on. He's from the old guard. Now, there are younger people there as well, but let's not be misled. I don't think that these are people who have suddenly decided to enter the other history of Afghanistan, the history of Anahita Ratebzad. They don't accept that. They think that's anti-Afghan and so on. They are misled because that's also part of Afghan history, but they want to deny it. But what they have faced are two things. Number one, they have seen since 2001 the reality of the power that the United States has. The United States cannot create a government. It's demonstrated that in Iraq, it's demonstrated that in Libya, but it can really bomb a country and devastate it. The mother of all bombs used by Trump in southeastern Afghanistan was devastating. So they have an understanding. They don't want to provoke massive aerial bombardment of Afghanistan. They don't want that. I mean, I think that is a deterrent of a kind. Let's not minimize that. That's one thing. But much more than that, there has been a lot of pressure on the Taliban leadership from regional powers. Mullah Baradar went to Tianjin, met the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in late July. They had a conversation. The entirety of the conversation has not been revealed. But certainly what one has heard is that they made an agreement that the Taliban would not permit the kind of extremist groups from Xinjiang to operate on Taliban-controlled soil. Secondly, that they will try their best not to allow attacks on Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. You see, there was recently an attack on a bus in Pakistan. 9 Chinese nationals were killed. So this kind of regional pressure, both from China, from Iran, from the Central Asian states, from India, from Pakistan, India's External Affairs Minister Jaishankar made a statement at Dushanbe at the contact group of Afghanistan, which is a formation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. He made a 3-point project, which basically talked about how Taliban, basically that Afghanistan's sovereignty must be respected, that Afghanistan must not permit itself to become a haven for terrorists, that it must, whatever government comes in Kabul must, maintain the peace with minorities and so on. Nothing was said about women in that, but it was still an advance of a kind. So I think that both the fear of the Americans coming back and bombing like savages again, and secondly, this pressure from the regional powers, I think will hopefully modulate them a little bit. And I think there are signs of that. It's not the Islamic law and women question that showed me that they will moderate things, but it's actually the fact that the son of Mr. Haqqani went to visit Hamid Karzai in his residence.
Yes.
And Mr. Karzai had made a tweet earlier saying that, the national government must be created. I thought that was significant when Mr. Haqqani's son visited Karzai.
Reaching out to the old regime, effectively, the previous president before Ghani under the U.S. regime. But coming back to Mullah Baradar for a second, again, who you said, and I'm hearing too, it seems to be the future leader of Afghanistan under the Taliban, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. He was imprisoned by Pakistan and then released. He was in prison for 8 years and then released in a deal negotiated by Trump and Pompeo. And there are pictures of him standing alongside Pompeo. For one thing, that's just bizarre and worth noting to, again, point out how weird these webs we've woven have been. But also Pakistan. Pakistan, I hear, is going to be the key influence in a sort of positive, natural ally sense for the Taliban-led Afghanistan. That's what I've heard. And yet, they had just imprisoned the future leader of this country, from what I'm hearing. And for 8 years, for not a short period of time. How do you think that's going to affect the nature of Pakistan's influence on Afghanistan in the future? Vijay?
Well, it's not clear exactly what happened with Mullah Baradar when he was in Pakistan. There are all kinds of theories. People say that, well, you know, what is imprisonment? I mean, he was held in house arrest. This is what people say, that, you know, this was basically a way to protect him. They didn't want him to be sent to Guantanamo and this, that, and the others. I mean, there's a lot of conversation. It was an attempt by Pakistan to basically put pressure on the Taliban to say, look, you've got to bend your knee to us and so on. So there are a lot of theories there. It's without doubt that the Pakistanis have an enormous influence on the Taliban. Look, it's interesting, friends, a lot of conversation about how the United States and NATO trained the Afghan National Army, you know, which dissolved in a flash. Lots of talk about that. Well, who trained the Taliban? I mean, where's that conversation? It's very interesting that Biden will be out there. They'll all be banging the drum saying, you know, we spent $88 billion training the Afghan National Army. Well, who trained the Taliban? I mean, they didn't train themselves. Where did they get the armaments from? Where did they get sophisticated weaponry? Now, of course, they control an air force. They just took over the Afghan National Army's air force. They have, as it is, Chinook helicopters and so on at their disposal. So, you know, who trained them? Well, certainly the Pakistani intelligence plays a major role here. And maybe other intelligence services of regional powers. We don't know everything about that. So it's a question that should be on the table. You've asked, you know, what will be the influence of a country like Pakistan? It will be considerable. But then again, Pakistan today is different from Pakistan in the 1990s, because Pakistan today is very closely integrated with the Chinese Belt and Road project. So Prime Minister Imran Khan doesn't have the space of maneuver that, say, military dictator Zia-ul Haq had in the 1980s. You know, the space for maneuver is simply not there. And so we'll see. You know, these are early days. The government hasn't even been formed properly. The Chinese have said they will not recognize, it's not up to them to recognize the Taliban. They are waiting to have the government take shape. You know, why should a foreign government recognize a political organization? That's ridiculous. You might recognize a government. That's a different matter. So the Chinese have said, we don't recognize the Taliban. We're waiting for a government to be formed. So I think that's what we'll see. You know, we'll see who is calling the shots in Kabul from outside. And that's significant. Will the Afghans be able to call the shots themselves? I doubt it very much.
And then two last questions here, Vijay. Just briefly, one, ongoing instability in Afghanistan under the Taliban, dealing with these other ethnic minority groups and Shia groups too. How do you see that playing out? And two, what form of government do you think they'll take? I was asking about the different political forms. You sort of said it's more important to notice the commonalities than the differences between them. But still, looking back, where do you think the Taliban will look other than the early 90s? Do you think it's just going to be a recapitulation of how they were then? Or are they going to look back to previous political forms and sort of move into that? In other words, what kind of state is Afghanistan going to be under the Taliban, Vijay?
Well, you know, that's a very important question. So again, when the Taliban came into Kabul in 1996, they were younger, they were more arrogant, they felt that they would go it alone in a way, and they looked at the various factions of the Mujahideen, which had just been in a fratricidal civil war. Hekmatyar and others shelling Kabul relentlessly. The numbers are very unclear, but we generally believe that more people died during that civil war than in the conflict against the Soviet army that was in Afghanistan. That was a very brutal period. And so when the Taliban came in, there was no appetite in Afghanistan, to be frank, to have people like Hekmatyar and Rabbani and others in government. There was none. So the Taliban went alone. Today, the situation is different. The Taliban is certainly more experienced. They are older. I mean, Baradar is older than he was in 1996. And also they look at people like Karzai and Abdullah and Hekmatyar and so on. They are not threatened by them. And these people don't seem to have the same kind of reputation of corruption as Ashraf Ghani had developed very rapidly. In fact, it's a little unfair to Mr. Ghani because the corruption is endemic in this elite, this Mujahideen elite. that was created in the Bonn conference. The corruption is endemic, but somehow they were able to make this a corruption of Mr. Ghani, so that even Ashraf Ghani's defense minister, General Mohammadin, sent a tweet out calling him the rich man and saying, he basically destroyed the country. Incredible how they've all come around to saying Ashraf Ghani was the problem and not this structure that was created out of the Bonn meeting in 2001. So it's likely that they may put some of these people into government. And it's also important to recognize that they will be fig leaves for the Taliban rule, because none of these people really have a genuine independent base. They have been reliant on European and US money and Canadian money. They've been reliant on patronage from abroad. So, they will be put there, and then the Taliban can turn around and say, well, it's a government of national unity. Well, in a sense it is. It's still going to be a government of the Mujahideen plus Taliban.
And it will still probably have to deal with some unpopularity due to the corruption that you were just mentioning. Very interesting getting back into the Bonn conference. We'd love to have you on again talking about this. Vijay, great talking with you. Very fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us. For those listening, that was the voice of Vijay Prasad. Great conversation with him. He is Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and a non-resident senior fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. You can find him online at thetricontinental.org. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming back with Maram Soosli talking about Afghanistan and Australia, talking about lockdowns in Australia, quarantine protocols and policies, as they've received a lot of flack internationally, and they're said to be getting more severe. At least there are pushes for it. We'll be getting into it with Maram. Want to know the truth about this one. Also talking, of course, Afghanistan. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined on the line by Maram Soosli. She's a political commentator and geopolitical analyst and is now a writer for RT, or at least she's got some articles up over there. She just sent me one, Maram. What Afghanistan's Saigon moment teaches us about America's humanitarian wars. That's the title of your piece over there. Welcome to the show. How are you doing this morning, Maram? Or night your time?
Maram?
Oh, Maram. Oh, Maram.
Sorry for that. I think I pressed the mute button with my face.
Oh, you're good. No, you're good. How are you doing?
Good. I'm early. Yeah, I had to unmute myself. I'm terribly sorry. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. Let's get into it. We were going to talk about Afghanistan. We're going to talk about Australia. I think the Australia one will be shorter. There's just probably a little bit less to talk about, so I'll start with that. Talking about quarantines and lockdowns in Australia. Australia and New Zealand have been, from my more Western perspective, pretty remarkably effective at keeping the virus down. New Zealand, many months without community infection, and Australia to a lesser degree, but still severe lockdowns. And when you look at their numbers, they're like way, way, way below where we are. Now, on the other hand, they also seem kind of draconian. And, I know from some of our callers and people I've read online, there's definitely criticism of what Australia's done and what they're doing, and some conversation about what they're planning on doing with making the quarantine specifically on entering Australia, where you have to basically stay in these government-run facilities for weeks. They're talking about making that more severe, more stringent. That has definitely come under some flack. But Maram, can you just set us up? How has the Australian government responded to COVID so far, broadly speaking?
Well, broadly speaking, I think you've got it right. They've been extremely draconian, but at the same time, in some cases, effective. It depends on which state. The state that I'm in, Western Australia, has been the most effective, and we haven't had many lockdowns at all, actually. What they decided to do was just make the border impenetrable. And so very rarely do they let people out, and very rarely do they let people in. But at the same time, the entire country is essentially now like a prisoner island. which is exactly how it began, you can't leave without permission of the government. And if you're going to leave the country, you have to leave for at least 3 months or you won't be allowed to leave. So basically, we're locked in. And I think some of the criticism is coming in for a couple of things. One of the things is they're letting international workers in, and people are wondering why it's okay for workers to come in that are not even citizens, but people who are citizens are finding it hard to come back. Also, mandatory vaccines, they're trying to make that happen. They're trying to do vaccine passports. And I think people are very much against it because at the end of the day, you know, it's your body, it's your decision. So it doesn't matter if the vaccine works or not. You shouldn't have to inject yourself with a substance that someone else created in a lab. So even if it's good for you, like it's up to the person. And I think that's it. But the thing is that they may not make it illegal not to take the vaccine, but they are talking about making people's lives more difficult. For example, they won't be able to get certain jobs, or they won't be able to enter certain restaurants, etc., etc.
That's pretty similar to what we have in the States.
I think this is a very dangerous subject. Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry for cutting in there.
Yes.
That last part is pretty similar to what we have in the States with, like, we're just talking this morning about nursing homes. Biden is calling to require nursing home workers get vaccinated, basically, because he was saying if they don't, 30% more people would die, basically. You can save a bunch of lives by doing that. But still controversial. And as far as I can tell, in the States right now, it's only New York City that you have a sort of comprehensive vaccine passport program for just basically like going out to eat, that kind of thing. And we've been pretty critical of that. I've been pretty critical of that specifically. I think, okay, you're going to require vaccines. I get it. You're a business and the state wants to reduce this stuff. But can't you also require that people show like a negative COVID test or that they've recovered from COVID and therefore have some natural immunity within this window of time? Do you see those kinds of conversations happening in Australia, Maram?
I think that a year ago, I actually predicted this vaccine passport thing was going to be attempted. And I think it's dangerous for various reasons. Not because of anything to do with vaccinations, but because it gives the government too much power. And it just opens the gate for other things. For example, maybe instead of just one kind of vaccine for coronavirus, it's going to become all vaccines. Or it's going to become, if you have a specific disease, you can never enter some. Like let's imagine a world where if someone gets a positive HIV test, they won't be able to get on a plane anymore. Or let's take it a step further than that. Let's say you have to get the flu vaccine every 6 months. That's going to cost a lot of money from the state that's going to have to pay for it. And people are going to be taxed for that. And maybe it's unnecessary, but all that money is going to go into the pockets of pharmaceutical companies for the flu, which may not be necessary. Furthermore, it could be something other than vaccines. It could be like a social credit system where you will not be able to enter a restaurant unless you've done everything that, is appropriate. I don't know why this virus, there's other viruses out there. Like, why do you have to have a passport for going to a restaurant for getting a vaccine for this virus?
Because 4 million people have died around the world. And in the United States, we have 620,000 people dead. We have 1,000 people dying a day right now. And from the standpoint of, the vaccine passports or whatever, look, anybody can make the slippery slope argument about pretty much anything. This is very specific in this case. Do you want people coming into your country without being able to show that they, at the very least, don't have COVID, or at the very least had a test showing they didn't necessarily have COVID? Whether it's...
That's fair.
Yeah. Whether it's the vaccine or whether it's showing that, look, I am clear in this moment. I can at the very least have, a little gray area within the context of that. But I don't have an issue with going into a restaurant and knowing that the people in the restaurant are vaccinated, especially when you have breakthrough infections these days.
Here's the problem. The vaccines, and this is data just coming out, they may prevent the person from getting very, very sick, but they don't prevent them from being a carrier. So you can be vaccinated, get coronavirus, and then have like a high viral load.
That's true.
Not have any symptoms, and you will spread the So the argument that the vaccine is making people safe, I don't buy into.
Well,
I prefer
that's
like
not
my
true.
state.
Well, that's not true. I mean, like you can take one bit of
We
argument.
don't know yet.
Well, you can take one bit of argument, and you could say, well, yeah, people still can transmit, and people still can be infected. That is true. To say that they're not making people safer, that's not true. I mean, still the overwhelming majority of the people who are getting sick and dying are people who are unvaccinated. So I feel
The data is still. I mean, to be fair, we don't know yet.
one
because the data is
out
still
of 5
coming in.
people who are being sick or who are getting sick are unvaccinated. By definition, that means 4/5 are unvaccinated.
I've heard another country, I think the UK, it was like 50 or 60% of people in hospitals were vaccinated. I don't know which vaccine they were on though. That's the question. Like, which one of them is more effective? All of the data is still coming in.
Maram, this is something that Jamarl and I have been going back and forth on in our own kind of way. And I'll point this out. Jamarl, remember the other day you and I were going back and forth on the word sick, where we were using slightly different versions of it. We were talking about exactly this, and you were using sick in the sense of like experiencing the symptoms of COVID-19. Right. And I was like, but wait, there's another version of this where somebody technically is kind of getting sick if they
no symptoms.
If they inhale SARS-CoV-2, if it incubates in their body and it spreads, even though they're experiencing no symptoms, that kind of qualifies as sick. And so there's this it's just the meanings of words.
Yeah.
I think something similar here could be, a similar case could be made about protecting or protection in the sense that we're using it. Because technically, like Maram, you were just saying, there's a way in which people are definitely 100% protected by getting the vaccine. So far, it seems, if you get it and you catch COVID, you get SARS-CoV-2, the virus, you're far less likely to die, to go to the hospital, to experience the worst symptoms of it. So far, that seems to be the case. On the other hand, if you're more likely to be asymptomatic and to be spreading it and to be allowed out in public with other people, just spreading it to anybody else, that's also kind of counterintuitively making you less safe. That's kind of the distinction I heard. Is that what you meant?
That's what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I'm a scientist. I'm for vaccines. They work most of the time. I do worry about the fact that the virus is mutating very quickly, and sometimes mutations like the same vaccine is not going to work on that mutation. I'm concerned about the fact that it was kind of like really rushed, and even SARS-1, like 10 years ago, we still don't have a vaccine for that. I'm also concerned about the fact you need repeat dosages of them.
Yeah, and
I wonder if it's going to be like a yearly thing. I just think, like, taking a step back, I'm not going to buy into the like scaremongering of these their vaccines are going to kill everyone, but at the same time, I'm not going to say they're perfect and they work and we should all have them and it's like the cure. And
yeah, exactly. And there's this temptation when you're trying to play them up because you want to be a good person in society, you want to do good things, and you want you personally care for it. You don't want your grandma to get sick, that kind of thing. So you want to convince people to take them, but you don't want to turn them into a godsend panacea, which of course they aren't. We've only got a little bit left, and we wanted to talk about Afghanistan with you. I'm just going to hand it over to you generally. Looking at this, we often talk to you about the Syrian war, looking at the collapse of Kabul, the collapse of the American war, the sad history here. What are your thoughts, Maram?
Well, actually, I wanted to mention Afghanistan because last time when we discussed it, I said that, the pullout is something intentional. And I still stand by that. It is intentional because if they had stayed in, they would have gone bankrupt. And I just thought that Biden's speech especially I was surprised that he called Afghanistan the graveyard of empires, because to me that sounded like an admission of defeat. Like, you can't read it any other way.
Wait, when you say the pullout was intentional, briefly, what do you mean? We've only got a couple seconds.
Oh, I just meant that they intended not to go down with the ship, essentially. They intended not to be completely destroyed by another 10 years of war. So it was a strategic retreat in that sense.
I hear you.
But at the
I
same
hear you.
time,
Maram, no, we've got to close. I'm sorry, the music's closing in on us. Maram Sousli, geopolitical commentator, geopolitical analyst. Great talking with her. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning and the fourth to last hour this week of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and from across the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent and maybe slightly manic corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man clinging to the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're surely listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty. Good morning. Again, everybody. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern. It's Thursday, August 19th, and we just finished up a conversation with Miram. I just want to give her social media out because we didn't do that in either the intro or the outro. We were rushing going out. You can follow Miram on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. Find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. And with that, let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news and COVID statistics, there are about 162,720 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. There were also about 1,128 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 140,900 cases per day. That's an increase of 47% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 37,296,000 people across the United States. It's also killed 624,365 people in the U.S. A new study by JAMA Pediatrics, JAMA Pediatrics, has concluded that babies and toddlers are more likely than teens to transmit coronavirus. While teens are more likely to get infected with COVID-19, those 0 to 3 years old are more likely to transmit the virus. Just interesting. In national news, in a speech with ABC News yesterday, President Joe Biden said that chaos was inevitable, quote unquote, as America withdrew from Afghanistan. Andre, I'm going to ask that we play this clip. This is, again, Joe Biden on ABC talking with Stephanopoulos yesterday. And we might want to, Andre, after this one, I want to do the July clip too. So it's the same thing that Jamarl did earlier. This is Joe Biden first up, just talking last night. Let's play this clip.
When you look at what's happened over the last week, was it a failure of intelligence, planning, execution, or judgment?
Look, I don't think it was a failure. Look, it was a simple choice, George. When the Taliban, let me put it another way. When you had the government of Afghanistan, the leader of that government getting in a plane and taking off and going to another country, when you saw the significant collapse of the Afghan troops we had trained, up to 300,000 of them, just leaving their equipment and taking off. That was, that's what happened. That's simply what happened.
But we've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
What did you think when you first saw those pictures?
What I thought was we have to gain control of this. We have to move this more quickly. We have to move in a way in which we can take control of that airport. And we did.
So you don't think this could have been handled, this actually could have been handled better in any way? No mistakes?
No, I don't think it could have been handled in a way that we're going to go back in hindsight and look, but the idea that somehow there's a way to have gotten out without chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens. I don't know how that happened.
So for you, that was always
I'm cutting right here because it's a fairly long clip, and I feel like we've hit the parts that need to be hit. And I want you to pause on the part that he just said. It's inevitable.
Inevitable.
It had to happen. It had to happen. There's no other way. 4 days. It was 4 days ago, George.
Always expected it.
Always expected it. Yeah, he's omniscient. Let's play this next clip. This was Biden back in July.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No.
No.
It is not.
Not inevitable.
Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
Look at that. Look at that liar. Listen to him lie. He just said chaos is inevitable. And listen to him literally using the same word. No, it is not inevitable. A takeover of Kabul by the Taliban is not inevitable. Well, what kind of chaos would you be referring to? Like cats and dogs falling from the sky? You see what I'm saying? My point is, that's the direct contradiction right there. And this is the disgrace. This is the real disgrace, is that they got this wrong. And the buck ultimately does stop with him. I get it. The intelligence communities, they also made their mistakes. The Pentagon makes its mistakes. But come on, Biden.
Yeah. I mean, and keep in mind, I am not giving Biden a pass on even that part. If you go back all the way to the Obama administration, they knew. Meaning they were lying even during the Obama administration, talking about the surge and everything else. They knew the place was going to fall.
Yes.
They were even quotes. If we leave, the place is going to fall. We don't believe that the army can or the military can stand up to the Taliban or any of that stuff. So, meaning they knew. They knew. What do you want to call that, lying or incompetence?
I don't know, but it depends on what you mean by no. Because
when I'm saying no, I just mean they knew that place was on the brink of collapse.
Yeah,
and they knew that as long as the moment that we left, it was falling.
Maybe as like a Hintergedanken, as a hidden thought in the back of their mind, something that they were barely conscious of but couldn't say, couldn't vocalize even internally. I don't know, because we talk to people and they're like, there's this internal peer pressure. They're in a bubble. The Pentagon, the State Department, CIA, the rest of the intel community, they're all in a bubble. And, it's a permeable bubble that they share. Yeah. It's a couple of soap bubbles attached to each other. But the point being, that's the real hindrance. It's not that they knew and they lied to us. Yeah. They didn't know because they were fooling themselves. They were deluding themselves. Internal bureaucratic culture or whatever, convincing each other that this thing. That's what we've heard too, right? So I don't know whether
it's a little bit of both. I mean, because I don't think, and to be fair to Biden on this part, I don't think that they thought it was going to collapse as fast. That part. I think they might have been caught a bit unaware at the speed of it. But again, I still go back to the thing on this channel. We were saying this feels like Vietnam. This looks like it's going to collapse. These guys are surrounding the Capitol. This looks bad. And so it's like, why were you guys so unaware of this? I mean, the CIA guy was like traveling through the Middle East. Yeah. Why were you guys so blissfully unaware as they were taking city after city after city?
Yes.
I mean, that's the part. Like, when they keep asking him, is this an intelligence failure or is it a failure of planning? And the reason it comes up is because it was so fast. It happened so precipitously. And you're telling me that your intelligence services, the military, all of these people that are supposed to be getting all of this money to give you intelligence, and all of them got it wrong? I mean, yeah, it's, yes, they're in a bubble on some respects.
Yes.
I guess I'm just pointing back to going back decades ago, the stories that the people who were in the military were saying and the people who were there on the ground were saying was that this place was going to collapse. And they knew that like a decade or more ago.
Yes. All right, back to the headlines here, and we got big ones. We're going to be talking about this in just a couple of minutes, actually, with Michael Goodwin. We're also going to be talking about the pullout from Afghanistan, and Ted Rall coming on 7:30 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. We're going to be hitting both again with him as well. This headline: City Comptroller for New York City, Scott Stringer, released an explosive report yesterday highlighting the city's failures to prepare for and respond to the pandemic, saying that the city's, quote, initial response to COVID was hampered by a lack of planning, coordination, and preparedness across city government, end quote. Chief among the findings was a long-term failure by the city government to plan for a pandemic. They relied instead on a nearly 8-year-old drafted plan that was, again, a draft, never finished, to respond to the virus. That plan did not contain key details, quote, on obtaining medical supplies during a crisis, on distributing those medical supplies, or on when schools should be closed and or reopened. Stringer said the 30-page review included only his office's initial findings because City Hall has consistently fought his subpoenas for documents from the health department, the public hospital system, and the mayor's office. Again, we'll be coming back to this with Michael Goodwin, journalist and writer over at the New York Post. We're going to be talking about this as well as Afghanistan. It should be interesting with Michael. He's a person. I'm curious to hear what his take is. I think I know roughly where he's coming from, which is we should have stayed. That we got in, we had this responsibility, and like you and I were talking about, we kind of wanted to talk with somebody on those lines because it's a conversation that we should have.
Absolutely.
Most of our guests are like in our camp of like we should pull out, but
yeah,
hey, it's fault lines.
It should be different.
Exactly. Yesterday, continuing with headlines here, yesterday the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the Texas law effectively banning second trimester abortions. The decision marks the first time a U.S. federal court has upheld a prohibition on standard abortion methods. Those who violate this law can face up to 2 years in prison. The Biden Justice Department has warned Missouri lawmakers about a new gun bill passed in the state, saying that the bill would violate federal laws. The bill bars state and local officials from enforcing any laws or actions that violate Missourians' Second Amendment rights, which the DOJ argues is an attempt to supersede federal laws, saying, quote, it purports to nullify certain federal firearm laws, prohibits enforcement of those federal firearm laws, and imposes civil monetary penalties on political subdivisions and state law enforcement agencies that enforce or assist in the enforcement of those federal firearm laws, quote unquote. Basically, these laws are telling officers in the state that they can't enforce federal laws, which the federal government says is a violation of federal laws. Pretty simply.
Federal law supersedes state law.
Exactly. And they're saying constitutionally, that's a big thing. It makes sense, but of course, part of a longer conversation, and exactly where and when states are supposed to have supremacy is, a matter of historical and ongoing dispute. Hope Solo, the former U.S. women's team goalkeeper, has accused star player Megan Rapinoe of bullying her teammates into kneeling during the anthem. This started back in 2016. We had a great conversation, by the way, with Cordell, producer for the show, who came into the studio. We talked about it maybe 25 minutes.
Yeah, it was a great conversation.
30 minutes from 7:30 to 8. Ended up taking some calls, too. Just an interesting conversation going back and forth, talking about Colin Kaepernick, talking about the history here, Trump, how it relates to Trump. Interesting conversation. Go back and check it out if that's your kind of thing. Joe Biden has announced that he is directing all nursing homes to require their staff to get vaccinated. The president stated, quote, now, if you visit, live, or work at a nursing home, you should not be at a high risk of contracting COVID from unvaccinated employees. While I'm mindful that my authority at the federal government is limited, I'm going to continue to look for ways to help keep people safe and increase vaccination rates. End quote. We played this clip from Biden earlier. Another side of this that he brings up is basically, he's I don't know where he gets the statistic, but he's saying, the population of nursing home workers is at a lower than normal vaccination rate. Mm-hmm. He's trying to increase it. He's trying to mandate it, of course. And he's saying if everybody working at nursing homes were vaccinated, deaths would drop by something like 30%. Deaths from COVID specifically. That's what you heard him say, right? Yeah. Which is, again, that's a big deal. I get why he's pushing for that from a public health approach. And if there's like one kind of business, one kind of facility that you're going to, mandate vaccines for, it would be something like a nursing home. That is the resting place, the home for the most at-risk parts of our population. It's like nursing homes, hospitals, that kind of thing.
And just to make a point, 42% of deaths are from 0.6% of the population. And that goes into like the elderly nursing home population.
Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't remember the exact number, but it's 42%. That number is, that's where he's coming from.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where he's coming from.
100%. Joe Biden, pardon me. Moving on, international news. The United States Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and its chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, fielded questions from reporters yesterday, during which they declared the airport in Kabul secure and said evacuation flights were ongoing, saying that they plan to evacuate all American citizens and as many Afghan allies as possible, quote unquote. They repeatedly did not answer questions about how they can ensure American evacuation. Hundreds of protesters have taken to the streets of Afghanistan yesterday, continuing into today, in a rebellious display against the Taliban. The protesters were celebrating the country's independence from Britain in 1919 by removing Taliban flags and replacing them with the national standard flag. In response, the Taliban fired into the air and the crowd, trying to get people to disperse. Some people on the ground in cities say they've been beaten up by Taliban fighters, and several died in the cities of Asadabad, Khost, and Jalalabad. And I'm seeing headlines this morning that protesters are moving into Kabul. So this headline will repeat itself in another form tomorrow, I'm sure. The death count in Haiti's 7.2 earthquake has risen up to 2,189 people. 12,268 have been hospitalized, and 332 are still missing, according to the Haiti Office of Civil Protection. They also stated that 600,000 people are in need of humanitarian assistance, and 135,000 families are displaced. That's a lot of people. The U.S. has deployed troops and other personnel to assist the country, including the warship USS Arlington, which will arrive tomorrow. Good conversation we had yesterday at, I believe it was 7:30, with Jemima Pierre.
She was really good.
Talking about Haiti, talking about this issue. Go back and check that out if you're interested. In tech news, Persephone, a fully autonomous robot, is being employed as a tour guide in a cave in Greece. That's Greece's Allistrati Cave. It's touted as the world's first robot tour guide, and she covers 500 feet before a human takes over. She's capable of giving the guide in 33 different languages. She can also answer 33 different questions, but all in Greek. Persephone is cleverly named after the Greek goddess who was kidnapped by the god of the underworld, whom she spent half her life with. In business news, a startup for RepairSmith has raised $42 million in funding to begin a new service of traveling car mechanics. The customer would be able to book an appointment online for an inspection or repair of the vehicle, and the mechanic would come to their doorstep for the service. This company's growing out of Mercedes incubator program, and after seeing success there, it's expanding into the greater market. With that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're back. Yep. And you know what? I might take us into a brief break. Let's do it. When we come back, we're going to be taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Then at 9:30, we're going to Michael Goodwin. We're going to be joined by Michael Goodwin again. When we come back, 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Anything we've talked about today you want to call in about. We've talked about the Afghanistan stuff quite a bit. Great conversation with Vijay Prasad. Mm-hmm. We're also talking about Colin Kaepernick, Megan Rapinoe, the sports stuff earlier. There's another story that if we have some time, might want to come to. Has to do with this like virtual influencer in China. This just this interesting conversation. Yeah, but we'll see how we do. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars. Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate. No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary. I see what you did there. Yep. Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320. And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we've got the three Michaels. Earlier on, we fielded a call from Michael from Sydney. We're going to Michael Goodwin in a couple of minutes. And on the line now, we've got Michael calling in from Silver Spring. So, Michael, the second, and I don't mean to diminish you, it's a long line of Michaels that you're joining the ranks of. Michael, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Good morning. Thank you. I am just wanted to make a quick comment. It doesn't relate to COVID. COVID's taken over. I'm just saying, what do you think about this idea? Having, when there's complaints with the police, why don't we go to the judges, the judicial system, the judges, because the police, at the end of the day, they do what the judges want them to do. So that's my comment. Like, no more police brutality. It's actually the judges are the ones that are being brutal. And that goes for criminal, civil issues, and international issues.
I kind of disagree with that.
I'm not quite clear. So, explain that. Maybe I'm missing something. Go ahead, Shane. Explain.
Well, no, like I said, I disagree, but maybe I misunderstand it too. It sounds like you're saying since judges are ultimately the authority to which police are supposed to defer, they're to blame for the problems of police. So if a police kills somebody, if brutalizes somebody, because the judge is basically their boss, it's the judge's fault. Is that kind of what you're saying, Michael?
Exactly, and the same thing with drugs and everything.
No, I don't buy that.
Michael, how is Derek Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck the responsibility or the fault of a random judge that had no idea that Chauvin was going to do that?
Good question. I don't have the answer, but it's just something that I wanted to throw out there.
But dude, Michael, I'm sorry, man. You come in, you got a controversial point, and then we throw you the obvious counterexample, and you're like, well, good thing. I don't know. I'm going to have to go back and think about it. Michael, thank you for the call. I do appreciate it. We have other callers too, though. Tarif calling in from New Orleans. We're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
Thanks for taking my call. Two comments. First of all, free drone signs, free danger in the hands of Haiti. New Orleans, we got the vaccine passport I called some places of business yesterday. Some of the owners was kind of upset, and some of them was kind of sad, depressed, because now the business, the foot traffic's been cut down some. So my heart goes out to the business owners. And my last comment is dealing with Afghanistan again. I saw a video on Sunday, which I forgot to mention. I forgot to mention too, by any means necessary in the backstory, that the Taliban was herding people into the airport, right? So I thought, I say, well, that's a tactic that they're gonna use to harass the U.S. by herding mostly men into the airport that probably work with them, right? That work with the U.S. And also they got a hold of a cache of weapons. What is not being explained what type of weapons are they? They are Javelin missiles that can take down low-flying aircraft, Stinger missiles, and to take other aim-to-take missiles like the Dragon and the TOW missile. All right, you got 10 to 80,000 people inside that state, inside that country, and a whole bunch of them is in that airport. So they're trapped around, right?
When you say you got 10 to something people, are you talking about Americans? Who are you talking about there?
Yeah, 10 to 80,000 Americans. 10,000 to 80,000 Americans supposed to be inside the country, and a whole bunch of them inside the airport that's surrounded by the Taliban. So with all that being said, why would the Biden administration put sanctions on the Afghan currencies and economic thing while you got close to 80,000 people inside their country?
Because we just lost to him, and Biden needs to show some toughness or something stupid like that, right?
Not right now.
I get it, but still, yeah, right now, these people are idiots.
No, they do need to show toughness. I mean, if you think about when Biden gave that speech and, you know, the television, all those, you know, we were seeing all these scenes, people falling out of airplanes and everything else. I don't know if part of that speech, he got very rough saying that if the Taliban does this, we're going to do this. And it's like, dude, you just lost a war.
Yeah.
What are you doing? But it's that. I mean, we're going to look tough. We're going to send troops back. We're going to show that we're in control of the situation to which we have zero control over at all. It's face saving. No more, no less.
Yeah, but can I say something?
Of course. Yeah, three.
Yeah, but I understand you have to be tough. When you surrounded in the airport, into 80,000 people, when you surrounded with your own weapons, against your own weapons turning,
Yep.
I got to reiterate again.
I didn't say it was good sense, Tarif.
Anti-tank missiles and Stinger missiles, and you put sanctions on them, on the Taliban, on the government, where they can't access the funds to pay for medical supply, and you got your troops still over there. Why you didn't do sanctions after you pulled the troops out in the civilians?
Tarif,
why now?
Tarif, you should put your suit on, because I hear the CIA wants you as a contractor, as an advisor. You're given better advice than they're used to hearing. They're on the line for. No, I'm just kidding, Tarif. But I kind of mean it. Tarif, thank you for the call. We've got others on the line too, though. 202-521-1320. Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, guys. Can you guys hear me clearly?
Clearly, yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I'm kind of conflicted now because Tarif just made a point that I have been raising that's been concerning me. Even though I actually called in to talk about Maram Sousi's point on the COVID, but I guess I'll go with the Afghanistan thing. So I said it before. I was a prior military, and I was a contractor. I was in Afghanistan for 2 years, accumulatively between two contracts, working with Lockheed Martin in my final contract, and not within the wire like most contractors. I was always outside the wire, always on constant movement and stuff in between FOBs and COPs, and just being prior military. Period. The thing that stands out of my mind with the whole thing is the way we play. That's not how military movements work. Whether we are packing up and running out or not, that's not how military movements work. So I'm in awe of it. Typically, the first and foremost, when you're pulling out, right? All of the weaponry, all of these things have to either be accounted for, prepared for movement, and sent out, or at minimum destroyed if not able to be taken. And I've not heard anything about that, right? I've heard people say that, well, the Taliban now has control of weapons, but I've not heard anyone talk about the types of weaponry that we had, or whether the types of equipment, the types of technology that we had. Like, for instance, myself, I worked on the FLIR system, the PTID system, which if you talk to John Kiriakou, I'm pretty sure he'd be familiar with. Basically, the eye in the sky is what everybody in the country called it, right? were these systems moved out, or were these systems left on the ground there at these numerous bases that we just seemingly the media is leading us to believe that they just abandoned? So that concerns me, because now you've, like, I heard your previous one of your earlier guests, VJ, I believe his name was, talk about how now they're in power, they're in control of the Afghan Air Force, right? So consider this: the Taliban is now in possession of some serious military weaponry. They don't have trucks anymore. Now they've got MREPs and strikes.
Yes.
we didn't have tanks over there, right? And U.S. military wasn't using Humvee. We didn't move around in Humvees. That's old school stuff. Like, we was giving that to the Afghan army, who, by the way, anyone that had been in the country for any amount of time could tell you, no one took their training seriously. Not anyone. And I've seen them. I've seen some of those training sessions firsthand. It's ridiculous. We're talking about regular drill stuff that I learned in, like, basic training, or like about face. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Face, right face.
And look, even in the Afghan docs, the military people who are there on the ground said the exact same thing. It was like, there's nobody who believes that these guys are going to be able to stand up to the Taliban. And the numbers that Biden were quoting were just on paper. It's like, we have 300,000 troops, and they have a modern force, Air Force, and all of this other stuff. And the truth of the matter is, no, now the Taliban has those things. And to your point, Brave, even the training, or whatever training they did have, well, at that point, even those guys are potentially under Taliban control. Like, and last point, biometrics data. That was the other point. So you made the point about the technology that these guys have, the intercept, the Taliban.
Well, he was talking about FLIR and these sort of surveillance systems from above, but related to it.
Yeah,
what you're getting
but related to it. So the Taliban has seized U.S. military biometrics data. Biometrics collection and identification devices were seized last week during the Taliban offensive. And basically, we tried to tag the various members of the various people in Afghanistan like they were basically cattle or animals or something. And now, iris, fingerprints, biographical information, and are used to access large centralized databases. Well, Taliban has that information now. And when you think of some of the female journalists, some of the people who might have worked with the United States, you think of some of the interpreters, some of the people who are left in the country, and if they have access to data where they can identify those people easier, oh my God.
Agreed. It's scary that it's gotten to their hands. Brave, you have mentioned being in the military before, but also fascinating to hear about the specific work that you've done. I'm curious, not leaving the weaponry there, leaving the rocketry there, leaving the equipment there, it seems so like such an obvious mistake that the mind is like, is this intentional? Was this part of some negotiation with the Taliban, where Biden thought the Taliban had given him assurances that they would hold off, or something like that they would hold off on taking it until we withdrew. Yeah. And in exchange for that, we're like, okay, we're going to leave you guys this cache of weapons. It's easier for us, whatever. We can just make more. It'll make more money for Raytheon and Northrop Grumman anyway, just making more. That seems so implausible to me, but so does the sheer incompetence of leaving all this stuff into the hands of your enemies. Any take on that, Brave?
I find it hard to believe that. I just did a video on this, as a matter of fact. I find it hard to believe that it's incompetence. First of all, if we look back at history, in most cases, first of all, we train like your earlier guest brought up. We trained a lot of these factions, right? Mm-hmm. Different countries to stabilize, to help destabilize these countries, right? And if our main goal is to stabilize, I keep saying, our goal was to build a country, the nation building. I've never seen that. I mean, I know they say that, but I've never seen that.
Yeah.
It always appears to be that when you look at the brown countries, let's just call it what it is, American Empire, we look at the brown countries, brown and black countries, it always seems to be about the stabilization, right? And then stripping and raping the country of its minerals and oils and all that crap, resources, right?
Here's the thing, man. We're pulling out. If we were to pull out and try to maintain relations and do the negotiation thing, do this little conspiracy thing that I'm describing here, I can imagine that the main reason we would be doing that would be to contest China, right? Against Xinjiang, doing the same terror game we were doing a couple decades ago, but applying it to China instead of the Soviets. The thing is, though, this $1 trillion rare earth mining deal that Afghanistan has with China sounds like it's pretty much well and done. That would mean that wouldn't work, right? Again, I'm kind of building a castle in the sky, but it's like you're saying, that's such a level of incompetence that it just seems implausible that it's actually unintended, you know?
Yeah, I don't think, I just find it hard to believe. First of all, I'm not saying specifically that they have left it. I'm saying that we haven't seen any questions or any information given out on that. And so we should be asking those questions. We should be very
good point
about it, because this is how these weapons end up in the hand. I mean, typically you see that these factions are using old U.S. military weapons that were left when that were gained in some way, form, or fashion. But in this case, we've left them entire bases full of stuff, as far as we know, because we haven't heard anything to the contrary.
Agreed. Brave. I'm sorry, we got another caller. Great points, and good sticking with you. But we have Centurion calling in from Missouri. Centurion, you're on. Are you calling about the headline? We've got to be kind of brief here because we've got a guest on the line. But were you calling in about the Missouri gun law headline or something different, Centurion?
Well, everything. First, I want to say that that's for Missourians in Missouri. Number one is we lost Afghanistan because we abandoned total war because of what happened in World War II. Colin kneeling, that's a bully pulpit. And I agree with Michael. The judges and the prosecutors have 100% immunity. That's the problem with the criminal justice system. And that's why in Missouri alone, we have 2,800 people that are sitting in prison that are not guilty, that cannot be released because of what these judges and prosecutors have done. And when they have 100% immunity to prosecution, that's the problem. They are not being held responsible. The police have partial immunity, which the guy that choked out George Floyd, he's going to go to prison, but he'll be released on good behavior, and that's a tragedy. And there's so many things with the weapons. The Taliban, the Afghan army dropped their weapons. The same thing, not a connection, but a comparison. The German soldiers went into the woods at the end of World War II, took off their uniforms, threw their ammunition and weapons on the ground. You can go on YouTube today and see people going into the woods and finding that. The Afghanis did the same thing. They knew it was the end game, and they just threw their weapons in the warehouse, took their armor off, their helmets, and left it. Not all of them, but most of them.
We've heard, I'll be honest, I've actually heard something similar from a guest we had on recently but here's the thing. I think this was Mark Frost, and I think we were disagreeing with him, who was saying if you look at what the United States did in Germany and Japan following World War II, we were far more brutal and it was far more effective. That's the total war thing you're talking about. But then there's a question of whether we should have been in Afghanistan in the first place, how we should have engaged it. Do we really want to engage in total war, killing a lot of civilians in an insurgent?
Want to.
What do you say?
Want to, because of what happened after World War II. The Western military powers looked at the world and said, oh my God, anything's better than what just happened.
Well, I mean, to be fair,
and then,
the total war thing was an outlier. That's not normal. I mean, the total war stuff is not necessarily, if you look back over history, wars don't tend to go to total and complete war. Usually it goes to some kind of capitulation or surrender. The German thing was different because these guys were basically Nazis, and there was going to be no extension of that Nazi government after throwing the world to where 40, 50 million people died, where we were going to tolerate and allow perpetuation of that government. I'm making the point it's an outlier. That's not a normal thing.
We dropped the bombs on Japan, and we said, oh my God, what did we just do? And now nobody wants to drop another bomb on a civilian population.
Well, nuclear bomb.
No, we drop bombs on civilian populations all the time. We were just talking about drones the other day. I mean, it seems like most of our drone attacks were against civilians. Against civilians. It was misfires.
I'm talking about large scale carpet bombing.
Okay.
Or drone.
Okay. Well, and here's the thing. We've got a guest on the line, and Centurion, thank you for the call. Point heard. When it comes to the Missouri stuff, that's, you say it's for Missourians, but that's the whole issue here is the states' rights versus federal thing. I don't know, man. But I get you, and thank you for calling in. Let's go to Michael Goodwin. We're going to go into our break. Michael Goodwin, journalist and columnist for the New York Post, is joining us when we come back. We're talking about Biden and Afghanistan and the Taliban. We're also going to be hitting this report from New York City's city comptroller about the absolute abject failure to plan for and in the response to the pandemic. And we're going to be going into that again with Michael Goodwin when we come back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. By any means necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And we've had a good show today. We've had good callers, and the topics have been quite crisp and on point. So let's keep that moving. We're going to continue with the conversation of Afghanistan. And I want to get into, on some level, the domestic politics of this. Meaning, what does it mean? Biden, a U.S. president, under normal circumstances, does not like a situation of losing a war. American presidents don't like it. It doesn't necessarily look good on them. And you can see the pressure that Biden is feeling based on the full court press that he's been putting out, trying to cover himself, his behavior, and the results of his works in Afghanistan. Yes, I am glad we left. No, I do not quite like the way this turned out and the way that we did so. And Biden's point of view is that it was always going to be this way. It was always inevitable. Andre, let's pull that clip, and I'm going to play it when for Michael. But let's get to the guest first. The voice that we're going to bring on is Michael Goodwin. Michael Goodwin is a journalist and columnist for the New York Post. He's one of our guests. He's been on right often, and always appreciate it when you come on, Michael. So thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure, guys.
Absolutely. So, Andre, let's play the clip originally of Biden basically telling Stephanopoulos this was inevitable. It was always going to be this way. It was always going to happen. Let's play the clip.
When you look at what's happened over the last week, was it a failure of intelligence, planning, execution, or judgment?
Look, I don't think it was a failure. Look, it was a simple choice, George. When the Taliban, let me put it another way. When you had the government of Afghanistan, the leader of that government getting in a plane and taking off and going to another country, when you saw the significant collapse of the Afghan troops we had trained, up to 300,000 of them, just leaving their equipment and taking off. That was, that's what happened. That's simply what happened.
But we've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
What did you think when you first saw those pictures?
What I thought was we have to gain control of this. We have to move this more quickly. We have to move in a way in which we can take control of that airport. And we did.
So you don't think this could have been handled, this actually could have been handled better in any way? No mistakes?
No, I don't think it could have been handled in a way that we're going to go back in hindsight and look, but the idea that somehow there's a way to have gotten out without chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens.
Yeah, so let's stop right there.
I don't know how that happened.
Michael, it could have never turned out any different. This was inevitable. It was always going to be this way. Nothing wrong. What is your take on that?
Well, I'm reminded of an old sign on a, corporate mentality or corporate training thing. If you think it can't be done, you're right. You can't do it. And that comes to mind here because Joe Biden thinks it couldn't be done. Well, that's obviously a failure of Joe Biden's ability to lead and to envision a better outcome. First of all, and I have to say, he is fundamentally becoming very dishonest about so many things. But the idea that the collapse of the government and the president leaving the country is what precipitated the chaos is simply false.
Yeah.
It was the American military withdrawing is what precipitated the collapse of the army and the fleeing of the president. It was the fact that you gave up Bagram Air Base, the seat of your power, really, because what it did was it enabled you to control the skies, and from the skies you could see quickly much of the country. You could deliver supplies or ammunition or bombs. Or when you gave up the air base, which was an hour and a half from Kabul, you just neutered yourself. And so you couldn't act. And so you had this cascading of people running toward Kabul thinking it was going to be protected. It's the only real airport in the country for the civilian population. So you just had like these dominoes falling toward Kabul. And for the president to say there was no other way to do it, that's just, I mean, even Stephanopoulos, who's something of a Democratic toady, says, starts with the premise that this is a failure.
Yes, and Biden denies it. And Stephanopoulos does not push him on that. He doesn't really push him on when Biden says it's 4. He doesn't really. That's the thing.
Doesn't push. Yeah, he doesn't hit him in a way that you would think he should.
No,
over something like this.
No,
it's not a tough.
It's like a gentle push.
That's the thing. And when Biden says this is 4 days ago, those people falling from the planes, it was 4 days ago, as if that's a gulf of time that will strip us all of our memories. No, this was just 4 days ago. It's just happened. Michael, here's another question that one of our last callers brought up, which is, this was so incompetent. And it seems like we may have left weapons, potentially many weapons, rocketry,
Air Force
vehicles, not to mention the Air Force, not to mention Bagram Air Base itself. Seems like we left a lot of our military resources to these people. Now, Trump was infamously trying to negotiate with the Taliban. This would be a guess, of course, but just looking at this, it just comes to mind. Do you think there's a chance that Biden did that and his administration did that? And what we're seeing, they're not telling us to us, but the incompetence is partly caused by them trying to make deals with the Taliban advancing quicker than they expected, that kind of thing. We wouldn't be hearing about it. Do you place any credit in that idea? Does that make any sense to you, Michael?
I'm sure there were some kind of negotiations. And the question of whether they involve the Afghan government also is unknown. But I think you're onto something. You would assume that there would have been some kind of negotiations. The other alternative is that the Taliban knew that Biden wanted to go. I mean, he said that publicly. He said he couldn't match the May 1st date that Trump had set, but that he clearly wanted to go, and he identified September 11th. Now, there's another significance, of course, to all this, which is that this is the summer is the fighting season. And so to be doing this in the summer, when you know the Taliban is going to be carrying out assaults, I mean, it's crazy. It's like you've just turned the country over to the Taliban. You didn't. Everything folded so quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
And the fact that the Biden people, nobody saw it coming, is to me unbelievable.
Yeah, it's a radical level of incompetence. I mean, because it's one thing to say leave, and I'm fine with leaving, and we had, like a year or more in advance. I mean, he even extended it from like May all the way out to like September to give more time to leave, with the thought being that if you have more time, you'll be able to kind of work that stuff out and work out the kinks and everything else. I mean, but this from National Review, just this, we mentioned this earlier, right here. Washington Post asks Mali if the military is considering retaking Bagram. Because like you said, Bagram has 2 airports, is far more defensible. You would think we gave that up basically in the middle of the night without even giving a heads up that we were doing so. It says, we've already seen that this week Bagram has 2 runways. It would have been a lot easier to protect people once inside. Is there any thought of retaking Bagram in order to expedite the evacuation? Now, the answer to that should just be flatly no, because you've already given it up. But that's not his answer. He says, good question, great question. What do you mean? It's a great question of asking whether or not the military is going to go and retake a base that they basically gave up in the middle of the night? How is that a good question? And he says, I'm not going to discuss branches and sequels of our current operation. But think about what that means. If the U.S., in this kind of weird schizophrenic way, after seeing signs of people falling out of airplanes and everything else, just horrific, embarrassing signs, then turn around and say, okay, now we're going to go back and take the base. Like this, it just seems like the planning, the intelligence, it just seems like they got it wrong across the board on this.
Oh, I completely agree. And when you, again, consider the big picture, so you had, as of 2 weeks ago or last week, 2,500 American soldiers on the ground there. Now you have over 6,000, right? And you're going to go take back the air base? I mean, one of the generals said, when asked about why didn't you keep the air base, he basically said it would have taken too many men to keep the air base and the airport. And so we gave up Bagram to protect the Kabul airport. Now, he made it sound as though it was a choice of either or. He said it explicitly. So if you're even considering going back to take Bagram, you are talking about probably at least 5,000 or 10,000 more soldiers. So isn't that evidence that you screwed up? Your goal was to get out, but now you're coming back in even bigger and heavier. Mm-hmm. What more evidence can there be that this was a failure? And so for Joe Biden to say it's not a failure, he's just trying to save his own neck.
Yeah.
I mean, this is pure a political answer, not an honest answer.
No, and but sadly, this is the classic thing. If you don't recognize that there is a failure, you're never going to be giving yourself the opportunity to learn from it and to respond. But also mentioning this, Biden's approval rating at an all-time low. Yeah. This has tanked it. And, maybe other things could have done it. And another side of this conversation that we could get into, Michael, actually, is the media's coverage of this. I'm not surprised that Fox is hitting Biden on this, but it is interesting to me that MSNBC and CNN have joined their ranks, too. That's another point we might want to come back to it. But
I think it is significant that the left media is holding a Democrat to account. I mean, we haven't seen this for quite some time. You almost have to go back to Bill Clinton to see the New York Times and other left-wing institutions be tough on a Democrat in the White House.
I hear you. You know what? What I might want to do here, Jamarl, I might take us to a brief break. Because, Michael, there's another story we want to talk to you about. This is big, and this is following on with everything we've been talking about. We've been talking about Cuomo, but a large part of when we talk about Cuomo is New York State's failure to respond to the coronavirus, to this pandemic. And we were talking about nursing homes just this morning. Biden mandating vaccines for nursing homes across the nation, while controversial, would have been very, very valuable if they'd had access to them last year when New York, under Governor Cuomo, was sending elderly people from the nursing home to the hospital and straight back into the nursing home without guaranteeing that they hadn't recovered. These were people who'd caught COVID, were either on death's door, or in many cases sadly died, who brought it back and were putting fuel exactly where the fire's most likely to spread. My point being, big failures on the part of New York State last year, and we'll be getting into New York City and this new city comptroller report, which is showing that New York City had a plan from 2013, a draft plan, an incompleted plan that was their primary fallback for responding to this. It lacked details on procuring medical supplies, on distributing them, other stuff we're going to be getting into too, relevant questions that New York has had to deal with. Big report coming out yesterday. We're joined on the line by Michael Goodwin, journalist and columnist at the New York Post. And coming back, we're getting into this conversation with him. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined on the line by Michael Goodwin. For those listening, Michael Goodwin is a journalist and columnist at the New York Post. Do follow him there. Michael, thank you again for sticking with us here. Can you please tell us, this new city comptroller report out yesterday in New York City, what are the details in here? I gave a high-level overview, but I'm sure you've seen this. How is this being received locally?
Well, I think that anybody reading it in New York will say, well, yeah, all that's true. I mean, what it does is it adds detail and flavor and specificity to what we all saw at the time unfolding. And look, I think that I don't want to defend the city in this regard. The state obviously had the same problems. Remember the ventilator issue. Even the hospital beds were in short supply. What you've been seeing in New York and a number of other cities is a consolidation of hospitals, mergers, largely driven by cost. And so you've had a reduction of overall hospital beds in New York City and state. And so when the COVID crisis came and so many beds were filled with COVID patients, even the hospital shut down everything else, no elective surgeries, no emergency surgeries for almost anything else, because they were afraid that they wouldn't have the COVID beds available. And that is one of the factors that led to the nursing home debacle, because the fear that the COVID beds would not be available got them to push COVID stable people out of the hospitals and into the nursing homes. And so I think you've had, that's one element of the unprepared situation that the city just found itself in during the COVID pandemic. The rest of it, I would say, is very much, I think, a reflection of Bill de Blasio, the mayor. Bill de Blasio, the mayor, he took office in 2014. He was elected in 2013, took office in 2014, coming up at the end of his 8 years now. We have term limits for mayor. He was never someone who looked ahead. He was never someone who was planning. He was just lazy. Still is. I mean, terribly lazy man. Sleeps late, he's often late for events. And there's no attention to detail. I mean, people who worked for him and left complained that you could never get his attention for a substantive meeting. He would start the meeting by saying, "Is it yes or no? What's your answer?" And the answer and the response would be, "But I want to discuss with you the practical issues and you tell me what you want to do." No, you tell me, is it yes or no? I mean, that was the kind of meeting he ran. And so you had a lot of people quit. You've had even some of the hundreds of former aides have protested against him. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And so when you see details of something like this, that the city was unprepared, I'm not surprised. Now, I would just add quickly, Scott Stringer, the comptroller for 8 years, ran for mayor, got bombed out in the primary. Where was he during all of those years? I don't know that he did any reports like this in advance of COVID. I mean, in hindsight, it's a lot easier.
Yeah, well, yes. And apparently his mom died from COVID-19. And so he has, it's callous to say that's an axe to grind, but he has an extra, he has that extra bias. But also politically, he's, going against a former competitor. That will be relevant. But I want to throw in a couple other things from this report. For one thing, they found that there was no central count of beds. No central count of ICU beds, the total available number of beds. This is kind of part of what you were getting at. Even though they were making efforts to centralize the system, there was no way to query public hospitals, private hospitals, everything in aggregate, let alone, everything individually, let alone in aggregate, to get a sense of how many beds were available, where they were, that kind of thing. In other words, that's part of what you want. You want a sort of central dashboard, a command center where you can say, this part of the city needs help. This part of the city is doing great. Let's shuffle people from here to there, that kind of thing. That's what you want access to. They did not have that. Another thing, they had 100,000 masks that were years out of date, several years out of date, literally all of them. That was what they had available to them. In February 2020, I'm quoting directly from the New York Post here, writing about this, the city's emergency management arm was forced to survey individual agencies in order to get a tally of the personal protective gear each had in hand, a task that ended up taking nearly a month. Wow. quote unquote. That's according to Stringer again. Here's the thing. These are failures across multiple categories. And I agree with you that hindsight is 20/20 and that Stringer probably has a dog in this hunt, so to speak. But these are huge failures that, you know, these are like the ABCs. These are the basics of responding to a situation like this. What are your thoughts, Michael?
Well, you're absolutely right. For me, it comes back to de Blasio. It comes back to the executive in charge. Now, Michael Bloomberg, who preceded de Blasio, was very much concerned with public health, was a big spender, but also a big saver. He set aside money for things like this, which de Blasio squandered. De Blasio spent more money than any mayor, not just by virtue of inflation, but by the leaps, 25, 28% above inflation during his tenure. And he blew up the size of the city workforce. So it was not about preparing for the future. It was always about favors with the unions, giving away programs, giving away money. I mean, wasting money by the barrels full just for some whimsical idea or a political favor. And so the real needs went unmet. I mean, the homeless thing exploded. The cost exploded. New York now spends over $3 billion a year on homelessness. $3 billion a year. And yet it keeps getting worse.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. I mean, I think the last stat I saw, it was $60 billion to get rid of all the homelessness in the United States. So if they're spending $3 billion for New York by itself,
that sounds low to me. That's my only 2 cents. But that number of $60 billion, that sounds like that wouldn't. I don't.
You think it's too low?
I don't buy that. But hey, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just telling you what the number is. But let's say it's $100 billion. It's still. I mean, for New York City to spend that much money on homelessness and still have an issue, and it seems to be getting worse. It just seems, like it's not getting the bang for its buck. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
Totally.
De Blasio, unpopular. When the people were going and running for the race, I think it was Eric Adams who eventually took it. But beforehand, they were asking de Blasio, why don't anybody want your support? Meaning nobody tried to get your vote or your approval in this process. Why is that? I'm going to ask you that, Michael. Is it just, he's just that unpopular? I mean, even among people within the context of the Democratic Party?
Yes. Two of the people who worked for him ran for mayor. Catherine Garcia, who finished second, and Maya Wiley, I think, was third or fourth. Both of them criticized him heavily on the campaign trail. So I think that was the tone, that the city was sliding downhill. The city, this is from the Democrats, just alone. So some were progressive, some are more moderate, but all of them, I think, felt that de Blasio had not been a good mayor, and they had sometimes various specific examples of where that was. But what is interesting about it, too, is that there was not a lot of over-criticism of him by those candidates. And that is because of the ranked choice voting system, and also the fact that they're all the same party. So I think they weren't sure, if you criticize de Blasio too heavily, are you driving away potential supporters in the second or third or fourth round of the ranked choice system?
Because getting negative like that
choice is to tamp down criticism, to make the campaigns more substantive and less violent.
Yeah, less vitriolic, which is the thing. That's what I cut in for a second, but basically people don't like it when you get dirty. It works. It technically does work very well, but at the same time, they're left with this lingering bitter taste in their mouth. Wait, what did this guy just say? Why is this guy being a bully? That's the sense that a lot of people get. We got to close this out, though. Michael Goodwin, great conversations, as always. Thank you for joining us. For those listening, Michael Goodwin is a journalist and columnist at the New York Post. Follow him on Twitter at mgoodwin_NYPost. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern. Have a great day, folks. Signing off. See you on the other side.